The room was still dark when you opened your eyes, the kind of deep, settled darkness that comes just before the first hint of morning. You lay for a moment on the simple wooden bed, a thin mattress stuffed with wool beneath you, a coarse blanket pulled up to your chin. The air was cool and dry, carrying the faint scent of old stone and dust. Outside in the courtyard, you could hear the soft trickle of the fountain, a sound so steady and familiar that it seemed like a part of the silence itself rather than an interruption. You did not need to look at the small window set high in the wall to know that the sky outside was still the color of charcoal, with no trace of dawn yet touching the horizon. After a while, you pushed the blanket aside and sat up, your feet finding the cool, smooth surface of the tiled floor. You reached for your clothing, which you had folded the night before and placed on a low stool beside the bed. The garments were simple and well worn, a long shirt of undyed cotton, loose trousers of heavy wool, a short vest with deep pockets, and a long coat of coarse brown fabric that fell just below your knees. Each piece had been mended many times, the stitches tiny and neat, a record of years of travel. You dressed slowly, without haste, the way a person dresses when there is no one waiting and no reason to hurry. The cotton shirt slipped over your shoulders with a soft rustle. The trousers settled around your waist, and you fastened the vest with a series of small wooden buttons that had been polished smooth by countless fingers. Once dressed, you walked to the small table near the door, where a clay pitcher and a shallow basin waited. You poured water into the basin, the sound of it splashing against the clay loud in the quiet room, and you washed your face and hands. The water was cold, drawn from the courtyard well just the night before, and it chased away the last traces of sleep. You dried your face with a square of rough linen that hung on a peg, then ran your damp fingers through your hair, pushing it back from your forehead. Your reflection in the small mottled mirror that leaned against the wall showed a face you knew well, unremarkable and calm, with the faint creases around the eyes that come from squinting into wind and sun. Now you were ready to take up the object that had brought you here, the reason for this early waking. On the table, beside the basin, lay a leather satchel. It was not large, just big enough to hold a few folded documents or a single scroll, and it was the color of dark honey, rubbed smooth at the edges and corners. A long strap was attached, meant to be worn across the body, and the buckle was plain brass, slightly tarnished. You picked up the satchel and felt its weight, light but significant, and you knew without opening it that it contained a single rolled document sealed with wax. You had received it the previous evening from the hand of a clerk who had given you few words and even fewer explanations. The instructions had been simple: deliver the scroll to the district seat beyond the mountains, a journey of several days. The seal was a deep red, the emblem pressed into it showing a tuger you did not need to read. It was not your business to read it, only to carry it. You looped the strap over your head and settled the satchel against your hip, adjusting it so that the weight rested comfortably. Then you gathered your other belongings, a water skin made of goat leather, dark and supple with a wooden stopper, a bundle of flatbread wrapped in a clean cloth, a small linen pouch containing a handful of copper coins and a few silver ones, and a sturdy walking stick that leaned against the wall beside the door. The stick was made of olive wood, twisted and polished by years of grip, and its tip was capped with iron. You ran your palm over the smooth wood, a familiar gesture, and then you were ready. The corridor outside your room was narrow and dim, lit only by the faint glow of a single oil lamp that hung from a hook in the ceiling. The flame burned steady and small, casting long shadows that barely flickered. Your footsteps made no sound on the packed earth floor as you walked past closed doors, each one a sleeping room like your own, occupied by other couriers, clerks, and low-level officials who served the small administrative outpost. The building itself was a modest two-story structure built around a central courtyard, with a fountain in the middle and arched colonnades on all four sides. It was a place of transience, a base for messengers, not a permanent home for anyone, and it held the quiet, impermanent feeling of a place where people came and went without much fuss. You descended a short flight of stone steps that led to the courtyard. The fountain was at the center, a simple stone basin with water bubbling up from a pipe and spilling over the edges into a channel that ran along the floor. The sound of it was louder here, a constant gentle murmur that filled the open space. The sky above the courtyard had begun to change. The black was softening into a deep blue, and a few faint stars still clung to the highest point of the dome. You crossed the courtyard, your eyes adjusting to the low light, and you saw the gatekeeper sitting on a low wooden stool just inside the main gate. He was an older man, wrapped in the thick wool cloak, and his chin rested on his chest as he dozed. A small brazier burned at his feet, the coals glowing a dull orange. You did not wake him immediately. Instead, you knelt by the fountain, cupped your hands, and drank a few mouthfuls of cold water. The water tasted of minerals, a clean, slightly earthy taste. You splashed a little more on your face, then dried your hands on the front of your coat. The gatekeeper stirred at the small sounds, lifting his head and blinking slowly. He looked at you, recognized you, and gave a slight nod. His voice when he spoke was hoarse and quiet, not much more than a whisper. He said a single word, a greeting that was also a farewell, and you answered in kind. There was no need for more. He reached for the heavy wooden bar that secured the gate, lifted it with practiced ease, and pushed one of the large doors open just enough for you to slip through. You stepped out onto the road, and the gate closed behind you with a soft thud, the bar dropping back into place. You stood for a moment, letting your senses adjust to the world outside the compound. The road stretched before you, a pale ribbon of packed earth and gravel, wide enough for a cart, but empty now. On either side, the land was flat and cultivated, a patchwork of small fields and orchards that you would walk through in the hours to come. The air outside was colder than in the courtyard, with a slight breeze that moved from the mountains you could not yet see. You pulled your coat a little tighter and began to walk. The first steps of a long journey always felt the same, a blend of lightness and intention, the body waking fully to its task. You set a steady pace, not fast, but consistent, the kind of pace that could be maintained from sunrise to sunset without exhaustion. Your boots, made of thick leather with sturdy soles, made a soft crunching sound on the dirt, a rhythm that soon settled into the background of your thoughts. The walking stick tapped lightly with every other step, a counterpoint to the crunch of gravel. You passed the last few buildings of the outpost, low structures of stone and whitewash that house supplies and equipment, their shutters still closed. A dog slept curled beside a doorway, and it did not lift its head as you passed. The sky continued to lighten, the deep blue giving way to a soft grey that spread from the horizon upward. You could now see the shapes of the nearest fields, rows of low green plants that you recognized as beans, their leaves still folded in the cool air. A thin mist clung to the ground in the lowest parts of the valley, lying in shallow pools of white that barely reached your knees. You walked through one of these mist patches, and the air grew damp and cool for a few paces, the scent of wet earth intensifying. Then the ground rose slightly, and you were out of it, the mist receding behind you like a gentle tide. The road made a long, gradual curve to the left, following the contour of a low hill. On the hillside, olive trees grew in neat rows, their trunks gnarled and ancient, their leaves a silvery green that seemed almost grey in the early light. The trees were old and widely spaced, their branches twisted into shapes that spoke of centuries of pruning and harvesting. Beneath them, the ground was bare, swept clean of weeds. You could hear the distant bleating of goats somewhere further up the slope, a sound that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once, and you caught a brief glimpse of a flock moving slowly among the trees, pale shapes against the darker green. A goatherd would be with them, you knew, wrapped in his own cloak, half asleep on his feet like the gatekeeper. You did not stop. The road continued to lead you forward, and you followed it with the patience of long practice. The sun had not yet risen, but the light was now strong enough to cast faint shadows, and the colors of the world were beginning to emerge, the reddish-brown of the soil, the pale green of the crops, the silver of the olive leaves. You noticed these things without focusing on them, letting them pass through your awareness like the pages of a book turned by a slow wind. Your mind was quiet, filled only with the simple impressions of the road, the weight of the satchel against your hip, the rhythm of your breath. After some time, you reached a place where the road crossed a small irrigation channel. The water in the channel was clear and slow, running over a bed of smooth stones, and a flat stone bridge allowed you to cross without wetting your feet. You paused on the bridge and looked down at the water, watching it slide past with a gentle, continuous motion. Small insects skated on the surface, making tiny dimples that vanished as quickly as they appeared. You unhooked the water skin from your belt, pulled out the wooden stopper, and drank slowly, the water lukewarm from being carried against your body. You took your time, leaning on the low stone wall of the bridge, allowing the muscles of your legs to rest without truly stopping. The satchel strap had settled into a comfortable groove on your shoulder, and you adjusted it slightly, shifting the weight by a fraction. Then you continued. The road passed by a small, squat building that was a public fountain, its stone basin built against the hillside, fed by a spring. The basin was full, and the overflow ran down a carved channel into a trough where animals could drink. You stopped there to refill your water skin, holding it under the thin stream of water that fell from a clay pipe. The water was cold and tasted of the mountains, a sharp, mineral taste that was entirely different from the water of the courtyard fountain. When the skin was full, you replaced the stopper tightly and wiped the mouth of the skin on your sleeve. A few sparrows had gathered on the edge of the basin, dipping their beaks into the water and then throwing their heads back to swallow, their movements quick and mechanical. The sun rose while you were at the fountain. It came up over the eastern hills in a wash of pale gold, the light flooding the valley floor and turning the mist into a thin, golden haze that quickly burned away. The olive trees were transformed, their silver leaves now glinting with a warmer hue, and the shadows stretched long and blue across the road. You felt the first touch of warmth on your face, a gentle promise of the heat that would come later in the day. You set out again, the sun now at your back, your shadow walking ahead of you like a silent companion. The road continued through the cultivated lowlands, the fields on either side gradually changing from beans to wheat, the green stalks still short and tender, rippling in the breeze like the surface of a lake. The breeze itself was gentle, coming in long, soft pulses that cooled your skin and carried the scent of wild thyme and warm earth. You passed a few farmers working in the fields, their bent figures moving slowly among the rows, pulling weeds or repairing irrigation channels. They did not look up as you passed, and you did not call out to them. Your presence on the road was a common one, a messenger in a plain coat, nothing to remark upon. The morning wore on in this way, with the road unwinding beneath your feet like a spool of thread. You walked through a small grove of almond trees, their branches just beginning to show the first pink buds of the season, and then past a field of broad beans with their black and white flowers attracting slow, heavy bees. The bees moved from flower to flower with a drowsy hum, their bodies dusted with pollen. The sound was a gentle drone that blended with the crunch of your footsteps, the tap of your stick, and the distant, occasional call of a bird hidden in the foliage. At one point, the road crossed a wider stream, this one with a proper stone bridge of 2 arches, its surface worn smooth by the hooves of countless animals and the wheels of carts. You walked to the middle of the bridge and paused to rest again, setting your walking stick against the stone parapet and leaning your forearms on the cool stone. Below, the water ran fast and shallow over a bed of rounded rocks, creating a constant, whispering roar. A kingfisher darted from a branch, a flash of blue and orange, and disappeared upstream. You ate a small piece of flatbread, breaking it into pieces and chewing slowly, the bread dry and slightly sour, just as you liked it. You drank more water, feeling it join the bread in your stomach with a sense of quiet satisfaction. The satchel remained against your hip, its presence a constant, reassuring weight. The seal of the scroll inside still unbroken, the message still unknown. You did not think about the message. You thought instead about the road ahead, the gradual slope that you knew would soon begin, the way the land would rise and the air would change. You had walked this route before many times, and you knew each stage of it as well as you knew the path from your own bed to the courtyard. The familiarity was a comfort, a map drawn in your muscles and bones, requiring no conscious thought. After a few more minutes, you pushed away from the parapet, took up your stick, and resumed your walk. The road left the stream behind, the sound of water fading gradually until it was only a memory. The sun was higher now, climbing into a sky that was a clear, pale blue without a single cloud. The heat began to build, settling over the land like a heavy blanket, and you loosened the collar of your shirt without breaking your stride. The sweat on your forehead and the back of your neck dried almost as soon as it formed, the breeze still steady enough to keep you from discomfort. The walking rhythm was fully established now, a seamless flow of movement that seemed to carry you forward without effort. Your mind drifted, not to any specific thought, but to a kind of quiet emptiness, a place where only the road existed, only the next step, the next breath, the next beat of your heart. And in that quiet emptiness, the morning passed, unhurried and complete, bringing you step by step toward the mountains that waited ahead, still hidden beyond the rising land, but drawing closer with every moment of this simple, necessary journey. The road carried you onward through the lowlands, and for a long while the land remained as flat as a resting palm. You walked along the same wide track of packed earth and gravel, its surface marked by the shallow ruts of cartwheels that had long since dried into hard ridges. The morning sun had burned away the last of the mist, and now the valley lay open and clear in every direction. A patchwork of small fields and orchards stitched together by low stone walls and lines of cypress trees. The air was warm but not yet hot, carrying the smell of turned soil mixed with something green and faintly sweet. You took it all in without pausing, letting the landscape move past you, like a slow, unrolling scroll. The olive trees that had dotted the hillsides earlier were here planted in orderly groves along the road itself, their twisted trunks so thick that you could not have wrapped your arms around them. Their leaves were the color of sage smoke, a soft grey-green that shimmered slightly when the breeze came, though the breeze was so light today that the leaves barely stirred. You walked beneath their branches, stepping through patches of shade that dappled the road like cool coins scattered on the ground. In the deeper shade, the air was noticeably fresher, and you slowed your pace just a fraction, allowing yourself to enjoy the brief relief before emerging again into the sunlight. The road curved gently, following the edge of an orchard, and on the far side of the stone wall you could see the dark globes of last season's forgotten olives still clinging to a few high branches, shriveled and black. A little further on, the olive grove gave way to a field of artichokes, their silvery, jagged leaves spreading out from thick central stalks. The plants stood in neat rows, and between them the soil was dark and damp from recent irrigation. A narrow channel ran alongside the field, fed by a small sluice gate made of wood, and the water in it moved with a soft gurgling sound that mingled with the crunch of your footsteps. You could see the tracks of a farmer's bare feet in the mud beside the channel, the prints deep and evenly spaced, and a wooden hoe lay abandoned at the end of a row, its handle worn smooth by use. The farmers themselves were present too, as you had known they would be. They worked slowly, without haste, their movements as much a part of the landscape as the trees and the stones. An old woman, in a faded headscarf, was bent over a row of young beans, her fingers moving among the plants to pinch away the yellowing leaves. She did not look up as you passed, though you were close enough to hear the soft, rhythmic rustle of her work. A little farther on, two men were repairing a section of the irrigation channel, lifting flat stones from a pile and setting them into place with careful, practiced motions. One of them said something in a low voice, and the other responded with a brief hum of agreement. Their words were too quiet for you to catch, and in any case they were not meant for you. You were a messenger on the road, a figure so common that you barely registered. You walked past a cart loaded with fresh-cut fodder, the green stalks hanging over the sides and leaving a trail of crushed leaves on the road. A donkey stood patiently in the shade of a fig tree, its ears twitching occasionally against the flies. The fig tree was broad and full, its leaves large and hand-shaped, and beneath it the ground was littered with fallen fruits that had burst open, their purple flesh attracting a slow cloud of bees. The bees moved with that same drowsy hum you had noticed earlier, a sound that seemed to belong to this time of day and no other, the sound of the sun climbing toward its peak. The road straightened again, and you could see ahead for a long distance, the pale track cutting through more fields, more orchards, the occasional whitewashed farmhouse with a terracotta roof. The mountains that were your eventual destination were not yet visible. They were hidden behind the gentle rise of the land, still many hours of walking away. For now, there was only the flat valley, the cultivated earth, and the steady rhythm of your own progress. You shifted the satchel strap slightly, pulling it away from where it had begun to rub against your collarbone, and the adjustment brought a small, satisfying change in the weight distribution. The scroll inside remained untouched, its seal unbroken, its message a matter of complete indifference to the road beneath your feet. After some time, the fields on your right changed to a vineyard, the vines trained low on wire trellises that ran in long, precise lines. The vines were just beginning to leaf out, small green buds unfurling from the gnarled brown wood, and you could see clusters of tiny, hard grapes that would not ripen for many months. The earth beneath the vines was bare and carefully hoed, and the air here had a faint mineral quality, a hint of the chalky soil that grapes seemed to favor. You walked beside the vineyard for a considerable distance, the monotony of the trellis rows creating a kind of visual rhythm that was pleasant in its repetition, each row identical to the last, each vine a variation on the same ancient shape. Eventually, the vineyard ended at a small dirt lane that crossed the main road at a right angle. You paused at the intersection and looked down the lane, seeing it lead to a cluster of farm buildings, a stone house with a flat roof, a low stable, a haystack built around a central pole. A thin line of smoke rose from a chimney, the first smoke you had seen all day, and it drifted upward in a lazy column that bent slightly to the east. You could smell the faint tang of wood smoke on the air, a homely scent that reminded you of other mornings, other roads. You did not linger at the crossroads, though. You simply noted the lane, the house, the smoke, and then you turned and continued on your way. The sun was well above the hills by now, and the heat had grown from a gentle warmth into a steady, pressing presence. It sat on your shoulders like a heavy wool cloak, and you could feel the sweat beginning to gather at the small of your back, soaking slowly into the fabric of your shirt. You reached up and loosened the collar a little more, then untied the cloth that held your bundle of bread and retied it more tightly to keep out the dust. The road was drier here, the surface more powdery, and each step kicked up a small puff of pale dust that settled on the hem of your coat and the toes of your boots. You did not mind the dust. It was a familiar companion, as much a part of the journey as the satchel or the stick. You came upon a public fountain set into the side of a low hill, just as you remembered from previous journeys. It was a simple structure, a rectangular stone basin fed by a spring that emerged from a crack in the rock, the water flowing from a carved stone spout in a continuous silvery stream. The basin was old, its rim worn smooth by centuries of hands and cups, and the stone was stained a soft green by moss and time. A shallow trough extended from one side, allowing animals to drink, and around the fountain grew a small grove of oleander bushes, their dark green leaves providing a dense shade. The pink flowers were just beginning to open, adding a subtle sweetness to the air. You stepped into the shade with a sense of quiet gratitude and unhooked your water skin from your belt. 2 other travelers were already there, an older man in a brown cloak sitting on the stone edge of the basin, and a younger woman who was filling a large clay jar. They were talking in low, unhurried voices, their conversation moving in the same easy rhythm as the water. You did not interrupt them. You simply waited your turn, standing a little apart with your hands resting on your walking stick. The older man was speaking about the price of barley in the market town, his voice a soft drone that required no response. The woman listened, nodding occasionally, and when she had finished filling her jar, she lifted it to her shoulder with a practiced motion and said something about the new mill that had been built near the river. The man made a thoughtful sound in his throat, and then they both fell silent, watching the water as though it might offer some further wisdom. After a moment, the man stood, adjusted his cloak, and walked slowly away down the road, his footsteps fading into the general quiet. The woman followed a few minutes later, the jar balanced on her head now, her back straight and her gait smooth. You approached the fountain and held your water skin under the stream. The water was very cold, numbing your fingers as you filled the skin, and the sound of it splashing into the leather was a clean, bright note in the warm air. You drank a few mouthfuls directly from the spout, the cold water washing the dust from your throat and leaving a clean mineral taste on your tongue. You splashed a handful onto your face, then another onto the back of your neck, and the shock of cold brought a brief, invigorating shiver. You filled the skin to the top, pressed the stopper firmly in place, and stood for a moment in the deep shade, allowing the breeze to dry your damp skin. Around the fountain, the ground was littered with the shells of pistachios, the pale split hulls left by travelers who had sat here before you. An ant was making its slow way across one of the shells, and you watched it for no particular reason, following its progress until it disappeared into a crack in the stone. A small lizard darted out from behind the oleander, froze for a heartbeat with its head cocked, and then vanished again. The world was full of such small, unnoticed lives, and you were merely one more moving creature passing through their territory. You left the fountain with reluctance, stepping out of the shade and back onto the bright road. The sun struck you with renewed force, but you had been cooled and refreshed, and the heat seemed easier to bear now. The road continued flat and straight, crossing a small plain that had been planted entirely with wheat. The wheat was knee-high, a soft blue-green that rippled in the breeze like the surface of a lake. The ripples moved in long, sweeping waves, chasing each other across the field and vanishing into the distance. The sight was hypnotic, and you found yourself falling into a kind of walking trance, your eyes fixed on the endless motion of the wheat, your feet moving automatically along the familiar path. The plain stretched on for what felt like a long time, though you did not count the minutes or the miles. You simply walked, the wheat on both sides and the sky above and the road beneath, the world reduced to these simple elements. The breeze was stronger here, unobstructed by trees or hills, and it pressed against your coat with a gentle, persistent pressure. You leaned into it slightly, adjusting your balance, and the walking stick tapped a steady counter-rhythm on the hard-packed earth. At the far edge of the wheat plain, the road passed through a narrow belt of fallow land, a strip of uncultivated ground where wild grasses and thistles grew in a tangled profusion. The thistles were tall, their purple heads just beginning to bloom, and you gave them a wide berth to avoid their prickles. The wild mint grew here, too, its leaves releasing their sharp, clean scent when your boots crushed them, and you breathed in the fragrance with quiet appreciation. A flock of small brown birds burst from the undergrowth as you passed, flying up in a tight, coordinated cloud that wheeled and settled again 100 paces ahead. They repeated this several times, always rising just before you reached them, always settling just out of reach, a moving island of birds leading you onward. The fallow land gave way to more orchards, these planted with citrus trees that you had not seen earlier. The trees were neatly pruned, their glossy leaves a dark, rich green, and among the leaves hung the last of the winter oranges, bright spots of deep orange in the foliage. The scent of citrus blossom hung in the air, sweet and slightly heady, and you could hear the low buzz of many bees working among the flowers. A small boy sat on a low branch of one tree, his legs dangling, a half-eaten orange in his hand. He watched you pass with the solemn, unblinking gaze of children, and you gave him a slight nod that he did not return. The juice from the orange had dried in sticky streaks on his chin. You walked through the citrus orchard until the road curved again, bringing you alongside a larger irrigation canal that ran straight as a rod for a considerable distance. The canal was lined with stone, and the water in it was deep and slow, carrying occasional bits of straw or a drifting leaf. The sound of it was a soft, continuous whisper. You followed the canal for a long while, your steps matching the gentle flow of the water, and the companionship of the moving water was a quiet comfort. Eventually, the canal veered away to the east, and the road resumed its solitary course through the valley. The sun had reached its zenith, or perhaps a little past it, and the shadows had shrunk to small dark pools directly beneath the trees and walls. The heat was at its heaviest now, a pressing weight that slowed everything, including your own pace. You found yourself walking a little more slowly, taking a little more time between each step, and you permitted this adjustment without resistance. There was no urgency, no deadline that could not be met with patience. You came to a small stone bridge that crossed a dry stream bed. The stones of the arch darkened with age. You stopped in the middle of the bridge and leaned against the parapet, the stone warm against your forearms. The stream bed below was a wide expanse of smooth, rounded stones, bleached pale by the sun, with a thin trickle of water still flowing at the very center. A grey heron stood motionless in the shallow water, its long neck curved in a perfect S, its eyes fixed on something invisible beneath the surface. You watched the heron for a long moment, and it did not move, and neither did you. Then a cloud passed over the sun, dimming the light just slightly, and the heron stirred, lifting one long leg and setting it down again with infinite care. You took this as a sign to move on, and you did. The afternoon wore on in the same unhurried manner. You passed through a village so small that it was hardly more than a handful of houses clustered around a single plane tree. The plane tree was enormous, its branches spreading over the entire square and casting a shadow so deep it felt like dusk. A few old men sat on wooden chairs beneath the tree, their hands resting on their knees, their faces turned toward the road. They watched you pass without speaking, and you passed them without speaking. A silent exchange that was perfectly understood on both sides. The road through the village was paved with flat stones, and your boots made a different sound here, a sharper, cleaner tap that echoed briefly against the house walls. Beyond the village, the cultivated land continued, but you could sense a change coming. The soil was thinner here, the fields smaller and more scattered, and the ground had begun to roll into gentle undulations. The mountains were still not visible, but you could feel their presence now as a kind of pressure in the air, a faint coolness that drifted down from somewhere ahead. The road was still wide, still well-traveled, but the traffic of the morning had faded, and you were alone on the track except for a distant figure far behind you, a small dark shape that might have been a farmer or another traveler, too far to identify. You walked on, and the light began its slow shift from the bright gold of midday to the richer, deeper gold of afternoon. The shadow stretched out again, long and thin, and the heat began to ease just a little, loosening its grip on your shoulders. You ate the last piece of your flatbread, breaking it into small pieces and chewing each one thoroughly, feeling the simple nourishment settle in your stomach. You drank from your water skin, the water still cool from the mountain spring, and then you walked on, your body moving with the effortless rhythm of a person who has been walking for hours and could walk for hours more. The cultivated lowlands stretched out behind you now, a broad plain of orchards and fields and quiet villages, and ahead the land rose gradually toward the first folds of the mountains. The road would soon narrow, the air would grow cooler, and the long ascent would begin. But for now, you were still in the valley, still walking on level ground, still wrapped in the steady, unhurried peace of the journey. And with each step, the satchel rocked gently against your side, and the road continued, and the afternoon slowly passed into the quiet waiting of the coming evening. The road began to change soon after you passed the last of the citrus groves, so gradually that at first you did not notice it at all. It was not a sudden shift, but a gentle tilting of the world, a subtle inclination that made itself known in the way your body had to lean forward just a little more, the way your breath came a fraction deeper. The flat valley floor, which had cradled your footsteps for so many hours, was beginning to lift at its far edge, folding upward into the first low hills that marked the approach to the mountains. You welcomed the change without thinking about it, your legs adjusting their stride automatically, your muscles remembering the familiar work of climbing. The packed earth of the road, so wide and even through the lowlands, began to narrow. The cart tracks that had been your constant companions faded out one by one, the ruts growing shallower and then disappearing entirely until what remained was a stony track just wide enough for two people to walk abreast. The surface changed too, from soft dust to a rougher mixture of gravel and exposed bedrock, the stones worn smooth by centuries of feet and hooves. Your boots made a different sound on this new surface, a sharper crunch with a slight ring to it, and the iron tip of your walking stick produced a bright click each time it struck a stone. The rhythm of these sounds blended together, a new music for a new stage of the journey. On either side of the track, the cultivated land was thinning out. The orderly orchards gave way to smaller, rougher fields carved into the slopes, their stone retaining walls barely holding back the wild growth beyond. The wheat and barley here were sparser, the stalks shorter, and between the planted rows you could see the native scrub beginning to reclaim its territory. Low bushes of thorny gorse, clumps of wild lavender with their grey-green leaves, and the first scattered pines. The pines were small and twisted, their trunks leaning away from the prevailing wind, and their needles were a dark, dusty green that seemed to absorb the sunlight rather than reflect it. They grew singly at first, isolated sentinels on the hillside, but as the track climbed higher, they began to gather into loose groves, their branches intertwining overhead to form patches of dappled shade. The air was changing too, in ways that you could feel on your skin and taste at the back of your throat. It was cooler now, noticeably so, and drier, lacking the soft humidity of the irrigated valley. The breeze that had been a gentle, intermittent presence below was now a steady current moving down from the heights, carrying with it a clean, sharp scent of pine resin and sun-warmed rock. You breathed it in deeply, and it filled your lungs with a pleasant lightness, chasing away the heaviness of the midday heat. The sweat on your forehead dried quickly in this moving air, leaving behind a faint coolness that felt like a blessing. You climbed steadily without haste, your body settling into the new demands of the slope. Your breath deepened and slowed, finding a natural cadence that matched the rhythm of your steps. 3 strides to each inhalation, 3 to each exhalation. Your weight shifted forward onto the balls of your feet, your heels lifting just slightly with each push, and your calf muscles began to make their presence known, with a worn, dull ache that was not unpleasant. It was the ache of work well begun, the body's quiet acknowledgement that it was doing what it was made to do. You paused every now and then to stand still for a moment, not because you were tired, but because the slope offered natural resting places, a flat rock at the side of the track, a level patch of ground where the path made a switchback. At these pauses, you would look back the way you had come, and each time the valley below seemed a little more distant, a little more hazy, the fields and orchards shrinking into a patchwork of muted greens and browns. During one of these pauses, you heard the sound of bells. It came to you from somewhere higher up the slope, a drifting, a rhythmic chiming that seemed to move with the wind. You knew that sound immediately. It was the sound of a flock of goats moving across the mountainside, each animal wearing a small bronze bell around its neck, and the bells were all slightly different in pitch, creating a kind of loose, improvised music that had no discernible pattern. You resumed walking, and after a few more switchbacks you saw them. The flock was spread out across a steep meadow above the track, perhaps 50 goats of various sizes and colors, some black, some white, some a patchy brown. They moved with the slow, unhurried purpose of grazing animals, their heads dipping to the ground and then rising again, their jaws working sideways in a steady, mechanical rhythm. The bells chimed each time a goat shifted its weight or took a step, and the combined effect was of a gentle, constant ringing that filled the air like the sound of distant water. Among the goats, standing motionless on a low rock, was the goated. He was an old man, or perhaps not so old, his age difficult to determine beneath the deep tan of his face and the folds of his heavy wool cloak. He leaned on a long staff, taller than he was, its top carved into a simple crook. A rough cloth bag hung from his shoulder, and his head was wrapped in a length of faded cloth that shaded his eyes. He did not move as you approached, did not call out or raise a hand. He simply watched you with the calm, patient gaze of someone who spends his days in the company of animals and silence. You raised your walking stick in a small salute, a gesture of greeting that required no words, and after a moment he inclined his head in return. That was all. You passed by, and the sound of the goat bells followed you up the track for a long time, growing fainter and fainter until it was indistinguishable from the wind. The pines grew thicker as you climbed, their trunks now straight and tall, their branches forming a canopy that filtered the sunlight into a soft, green-tinted gloom. The track wound through them in a series of gentle curves, following the contour of the hillside, and the ground beneath the trees was covered with a thick carpet of fallen needles. The needles were dry and brown, and they muffled your footsteps so that you seemed to be walking in a deep quiet, the crunch of gravel replaced by a soft, rustling whisper. The scent of resin was stronger here, a sharp, clean smell that seemed to coat the inside of your nose, and you could see beads of sticky amber sap oozing from cracks in the pine bark, catching the light like tiny jewels. Occasionally, the track would emerge from the forest onto a bare, rocky outcrop, where the wind struck you full in the face, cold and bracing. At these places, you could see the valley below spread out like a map, the fields reduced to tiny squares of color, the village you would pass through now just a cluster of pale dots around the great plane tree. A thin haze hung over the lowlands, blurring the details, and beyond it you could just make out the glint of a river winding its way toward the distant sea. You did not linger long at these viewpoints. The wind was too insistent, pulling at your coat and making your eyes water. But you took a moment each time to orient yourself, to note how far you had come, and how the landscape had transformed from the familiar, cultivated plain to this wilder, more rugged country. The track continued to rise, and with the rising came a growing sense of solitude. You had seen no other travelers since the Gotha, and the only sounds were the wind in the pines, the occasional call of a bird you could not identify, and the steady rhythm of your own movement. The solitude was not lonely. It was spacious and quiet, a kind of open emptiness that allowed your thoughts to drift without catching on anything. You found yourself noticing small things with a new clarity, the way a single pine cone lay perfectly centered on a flat stone, the way a patch of moss glowed a vivid green in a shaft of sunlight, the way your own shadow moved across the ground with a life of its own. After a long stretch of forest, the track brought you to a place where the hillside opened up into a broad, sloping meadow. The grass here was short and sun-bleached, dotted with small white flowers that you did not know the name of. A stream cut through the meadow, its water coming from somewhere higher up, and it ran over a bed of smooth, dark stones with a quiet, continuous murmur. The track crossed the stream at a shallow ford, and you paused there to refill your water skin. The water was bitterly cold, so cold that it made your teeth ache, and it tasted of melted snow and dark rock. You drank deeply, then sat down on a large flat stone beside the stream and allowed yourself a longer rest. You loosened a satchel strap and let the weight rest on the ground beside you, though you kept one hand on it out of habit. You took out the last of your flatbread, which was now slightly stale but still good, and you ate it slowly, tearing off small pieces and chewing each one until it was soft. The sun was warm on your face, but the breeze was cool and the combination was perfectly balanced, neither too hot nor too cold. You watched the stream flow past, its surface wrinkling over the stones, and you listened to the sound of the water, letting it fill your ears until there was no room for anything else. A small brown bird came down to the water's edge and drank with quick, nervous dips of its head, then flew away in a blur of wings. When the bread was finished, you remained sitting for a little while longer, in no hurry to move. The meadow was peaceful, the sky above a deep, cloudless blue, and your body felt strong and rested, ready for the rest of the climb, but content to wait. You thought about the scroll in the satchel for the first time in many hours, and you wondered in a distant, idle way what message it contained. It might be a report on tax collections, a request for supplies, a legal document requiring a signature, a personal letter from one official to another. It did not matter. Your task was to carry it, not to read it, and the task was its own reward. You picked up the satchel, settled the strap across your chest once more, and rose to your feet with the easy, practiced motion of someone who has done this 1,000 times. Beyond the meadow, the track grew steeper. The switchbacks became tighter, the path narrower, and the pine forest thinned out as the soil grew rockier and less able to support large trees. The pines gave way to scrubby junipers and low, cushion-shaped bushes that clung to the crevices in the rock. The air was noticeably thinner now, though still easy to breathe, and it had a sharp, crystalline quality that made every scent more distinct. The dusty smell of the juniper berries, the mineral tang of the exposed rock, the faint, distant sweetness of wild thyme crushed underfoot. The loose pebbles that littered the track were a constant presence now, and you had to place your feet with care to avoid sending them skittering down the slope. Every now and then, despite your care, a stone would break loose and go bouncing down the hillside, its sound fading quickly into the vast silence. You watched the path of one such pebble as it tumbled and leaped, finally coming to rest in a clump of dry grass far below, and you found yourself thinking about how long that pebble had waited to make that journey, how many years it had sat on the track before your foot dislodged it. The thought was not a profound one, just a passing ripple on the surface of your mind, and it faded as quickly as it had come. The climbing continued, and the sun began its slow descent toward the western hills. The light changed, taking on the warm golden hue of late afternoon, and the shadows stretched out long and thin across the slopes. The heat of the day faded, replaced by a growing chill that seeped through your coat and made you grateful for its thick wool. You fastened the top button, which you had left open all day, and pulled the collar up around your neck. The wind was stronger now, a constant pressure that pushed against you as you climbed, and you leaned into it with a kind of quiet determination. You came to a place where the track ran along the edge of a small ravine, the drop on one side steep but not sheer, covered with a tangle of wild roses and thorny scrub. The ravine was narrow, and at its bottom you could hear the rush of water, a stream or a small river that was invisible beneath the dense foliage. The sound was louder than you expected, a continuous roar that filled the ravine and echoed off the rock walls. You walked along the edge of the ravine for some time, the track wide enough here to feel safe, and you watched the shadows deepen in the hollows below. Eventually the track veered away from the ravine and climbed a short, steep pitch that led to a level area, a kind of shoulder on the mountainside where the ground flattened out before rising again. This was the place you had been looking for, the shaded outcrop you remembered from previous journeys. A large rock overhang jutted out from the hillside, creating a natural shelter, its underside blackened by the smoke of countless old fires. The ground beneath the overhang was flat and covered with a fine, dry dust. You stepped into the shade and felt the immediate relief of being out of the wind and sun. You set down your walking stick, removed the satchel, and sat with your back against the cool rock wall. From this vantage point, you could see the valley below, now veiled in a soft golden haze, the fields and villages reduced to an abstract pattern of color and light. The distance had erased all the details, all the individual trees and houses and walls, leaving only the broad shapes of the landscape, the green sweep of the plain, the silver thread of the river, the dark smudge of a distant forest. You looked at it without any particular emotion, simply observing, letting your eyes wander across the vast expanse until they grew tired. You ate a handful of dried figs that you had tucked into the pocket of your vest, their sweetness intense and chewy, and you drank the last of the water from your skin. The stream in the meadow was far behind you now, but you knew there would be another source of water before nightfall, a spring near the caravanserais that waited somewhere ahead. You were not worried. You were never worried on these journeys. The road provided what was needed, and you accepted what came with a quiet, steady faith that had been built over years of walking. The rest was a long one. You allowed yourself the luxury of sitting still, of doing nothing at all, of letting your mind drift into a state that was almost sleep. The sound of the wind in the junipers was a soft, sighing whisper, and the rock at your back was solid and comforting. You closed your eyes for a few minutes, not sleeping, but floating in a pleasant darkness, aware of your own breathing and the slow beat of your heart. When you opened your eyes again, the light had shifted just perceptibly, the shadows a little longer, the gold a little deeper. It was time to move. You rose slowly, stretching your arms above your head and feeling the pleasant pull of muscles that had been worked and then rested. You brushed the dust from your coat, picked up the satchel and the stick, and stepped out from under the overhang. The wind hit you again, but you were ready for it now, and you turned to face the track that continued to climb. The first ascent was nearly done, the caravanserai not far ahead, and the rhythm of the journey was as steady and unhurried as it had been since the moment you walked out of the outpost gate that morning. You took a deep breath of the thin, resin-scented air, and you began to walk once more, each step carrying you higher into the quiet, waiting mountains. The track continued its slow, winding ascent through the thinning trees, and after a time you began to sense that you were nearing the highest point of this stage of the journey. It was not something you could see, not yet, but a feeling in the air and in the shape of the land. The slope was easing, the steep pitches growing shorter and the level stretches between them longer, and the wind, which had been a steady companion all afternoon, began to blow with a new openness, as if it had more room to move. The junipers and low scrub gave way to bare rock and scattered tufts of coarse grass that grew in the cracks, their blades bleached pale by the sun and wind. The soil, where any remained, was thin and gritty, a reddish-brown powder that clung to your boots. You rounded a shoulder of the mountain, a great curve of exposed granite that blocked your view to the north, and suddenly the world opened out before you. You had reached the saddle, the broad pass between two peaks that marked the highest point of this section of road. The ground here was almost level, a wide, shallow depression that stretched for several hundred paces in either direction, flanked by the rising slopes of the mountains on both sides. The peaks themselves were not the highest in the range, but they were high enough, their upper reaches bare and rocky, streaked with the dark lines of old snowmelt channels. They stood like silent guardians, their presence immense but not threatening, and the pass between them felt sheltered, a resting place carved by time and weather. Near the center of the saddle lay a small tarn, a pool of dark water fed by underground springs and the slow melt of distant snow. Its surface was smooth, almost unnaturally so, and it reflected the pale blue of the late afternoon sky with a stillness that seemed to belong to another world. The wind, which had been so constant and insistent, barely ruffled the water. Instead, it seemed to press it flat, smoothing it like a hand passing over a tablecloth. Around the edges of the tarn grew a fringe of low sedges and a few hardy wild flowers, their colors muted, their stems bent by the constant wind. You walked to the edge of the water and stood there for a moment, looking down at the perfect mirror of the sky. A small insect skated across the surface, leaving a trail of tiny ripples that spread and faded, and then the stillness returned as if nothing had happened. You straightened up and looked across the saddle, and there, built against the lower slope of the northern peak, was the caravanserais. It was a solid, rectangular structure of grey stone, its walls thick and windowless on the ground floor, its roof flat and edged with a low parapet. The building was ancient, you knew, though you did not know exactly how old. It had been standing here for centuries, serving travelers and merchants and messengers, exactly like yourself. Its design was simple and functional, a fortress against the cold mountain nights, rather than any kind of decoration. The stones were rough-hewn and fitted together without mortar, their surfaces weathered by wind and frost into a patchwork greys and browns and pale lichens. A single arched gateway faced the road, its wooden doors standing open, and above the arch a faded inscription was carved into the stone, its letters worn almost smooth by time. You walked toward the caravanserai with the slow, measured pace of someone who has reached his destination for the day. The road led directly to the gate, widening into a stony apron where carts and animals could be assembled. A few mules stood tethered to a long wooden rail beside the wall, their heads lowered, their tails switching lazily against the flies. They paid you no attention as you passed. Near the gate, a pile of firewood was stacked neatly against the wall, and a few clay jars, large enough to hold oil or grain, stood in a row beside the entrance. The whole scene was one of quiet, orderly utility, a place designed not for comfort but for survival, and yet there was a kind of comfort in its very plainness. You passed through the arched gateway and stepped into the courtyard. The transition from the bright, windy pass to the sheltered interior was immediate, the noise of the wind dropping to a distant murmur. The courtyard was a large, rectangular space open to the sky, paved with the same grey stone as the walls, worn smooth in the center by the passage of countless feet. In the middle of the courtyard, directly beneath the open sky, stood the water basin. It was a circular pool, perhaps 4 paces across, lined with stone and fed by a pipe that emerged from the wall of the courtyard, carrying water from a spring higher up the mountain. The water overflowed the rim of the basin in a thin, constant sheet, draining away through a channel cut into the floor, and the sound of it was a soft, continuous splashing that filled the courtyard like a gentle rain. Around the perimeter of the courtyard on all four sides ran a series of deep alcoves, each one large enough to hold a few travelers or a modest amount of goods. The alcoves were separated by thick stone pillars that supported the upper floor, and their floors were raised slightly above the level of the courtyard, covered with wooden platforms that served as sleeping spaces. Straw mats were rolled up neatly on each platform, and a few of them had been unrolled and spread out, marking the spots where other travelers had already settled. The alcoves were dim, their interiors in deep shadow, but you could make out the shapes of people resting, a few bundles of merchandise, a saddle propped against a pillar. The air in the courtyard was cool and still, carrying the faint, clean smell of the water basin mixed with the dry scent of old stone. You stood in the center of the courtyard near the basin and allowed yourself a moment to simply take in the space. The caravanserai was not full, but neither was it empty. A handful of other travelers were present, their quiet presence adding to the sense of calm rather than disturbing it. In one alcove, a merchant was unpacking a bundle of cloth, unfolding each length with careful hands and inspecting it by the light of a small oil lamp. In another, two men sat cross-legged on a straw mat, sharing a meal from a common bowl, their conversation so low that it was nothing more than a soft murmur. A third traveler, a woman wrapped in a dark cloak, was kneeling by the water basin, washing her hands and face with slow, deliberate motions. No one looked up at your arrival, and no one greeted you with more than a brief glance. This was the custom of the road. Travelers came and went, and each kept to their own small circle of quiet. You walked to the far side of the courtyard, where a narrow doorway led to a small chamber that served as the keeper's quarters. The keeper was an old man with a stooped back and hands knotted by years of work, and he sat on a low stool beside the door, a clay cup of tea steaming in his hands. He looked up as you approached, his eyes pale and calm, and he gave you a small nod of recognition. You spoke the customary greeting, your voice low and unhurried, and he responded in kind, his words a soft rumble in his chest. You asked for a space for the night, and he gestured with his cup toward one of the empty alcoves near the eastern wall. There was no exchange of money, not yet. The payment would be made in the morning, a few small coins for the shelter and the meal, and the amount was so customary that it required no discussion. He walked to the alcove he had indicated, a recessed space just wide enough for a single traveler, with a wooden platform raised a hand's breadth above the stone floor. A straw mat, tightly rolled, waited at one end of the platform, and a small niche in the wall provided a place to set a lamp or a water skin. The alcove was clean, the straw smelling faintly of dried grass and dust. You removed your satchel and set it carefully at the head of the platform, then unrolled the straw mat and spread it out. The mat was thick and surprisingly soft, its surface worn smooth by many bodies. You laid your walking stick on the floor beside the platform and sat down, your back against the cool stone pillar, your legs stretched out before you. For a while, you simply sat there, allowing the stillness of the caravanserai to settle around you. The journey of the day was complete, the miles walked and the heights climbed now existing only as a pleasant, distant ache in your legs. You removed your boots, loosening the laces with slow fingers, and set them on the floor beside the stick. Your feet, freed from the leather, felt light and cool, and you flexed your toes against the straw mat with a quiet sense of relief. You could hear the water basin splashing steadily in the courtyard, and behind that, the distant sigh of the wind moving through the pass outside the walls. The sounds blended together into a kind of quiet music, a lullaby woven from the elements. As the afternoon light began to fade, the keeper emerged from his chamber carrying a large clay pot and a stack of wooden bowls. He moved slowly across the courtyard, his footsteps shuffling on the stone, and he stopped at each occupied alcove to offer a portion of the evening meal. When he reached your alcove, he dipped a ladle into the pot and filled one of the bowls with a thick, steaming lentil soup. The soup was a deep brownish green, flecked with bits of onion and a trace of oil, and the smell of it rose up warm and savory. He handed you the bowl and a piece of flatbread, the same kind of bread you had carried with you, fresh and soft from being kept wrapped in a cloth near the fire. You thanked him with a quiet word, and he nodded and moved on to the next traveler. You ate slowly, as you had learned to do, savoring each spoonful of the soup. It was simple food, lentils cooked until they were soft and beginning to break apart, seasoned with nothing more than salt and perhaps a pinch of dried mint. But after a day of walking, it tasted rich and deeply satisfying. You tore pieces of the flatbread and dipped them into the soup, letting them soak up the broth, and you chewed each mouthful thoroughly before swallowing. The warmth of the meal spread through your chest and stomach, chasing away the chill that had settled into your bones during the long climb. You ate until the bowl was empty, then used the last scrap of bread to wipe the inside clean. The keeper would collect the bowls later, you knew, and wash them at the basin. Around the courtyard, the other travelers were eating their own meals in the same quiet manner. The merchant with the cloth had set aside his work and was spooning soup from his bowl, his eyes half closed with weariness. The two men who had been sharing the common bowl had finished their meal and were now reclining on their mats, speaking in low voices about something you could not hear. The woman in the dark cloak had retreated to her alcove and sat with her back against the pillar, her bowl balanced on her knee. The only sounds were the soft clink of wooden spoons against clay, the murmur of quiet conversation, and the constant, gentle splash of the water basin. It was a scene of profound peace, a gathering of strangers united only by the road and the night, and you felt a quiet sense of belonging that required no words. When you had finished eating, you rose and walked to the water basin. The sky above the courtyard had deepened to a soft violet, and the first stars were just beginning to appear, pale pinpricks of light in the vast dome. You knelt by the basin and rinsed your bowl and spoon in the cold water, scrubbing them clean with your fingers. The water was icy, numbing your hands, and you worked quickly. You set the clean bowl on the rim of the basin to be collected, then cupped your hands and drank directly from the overflow stream. The water was the same cold, mineral-tasting water you had drunk from the spring earlier, and it washed the last taste of the soup from your mouth. You splashed a little on your face, dried your hands on the front of your coat, and walked back to your alcove. The keeper had begun to light the oil lamps. There were only a few of them, placed in niches along the walls of the courtyard, and their flames were small and steady, casting pools of warm orange light that barely reached the center of the courtyard. The lamps were simple clay vessels with a floating wick, and they burned with a faint, oily smell that mingled with the scent of stone and straw. The light they gave was enough to see by, enough to walk across the courtyard without stumbling, but it left the alcoves in deep shadow, creating small caves of darkness where a person could rest undisturbed. You settled onto your platform, stretching out on the straw mat with a long, slow exhale. You did not undress, only loosened the collar of your shirt and the belt of your trousers. Your coat you kept on, using it as an extra blanket, its heavy wool trapping the warmth of your body. You pulled the satchel up and placed it at the head of the mat, its leather surface cool against your cheek when you lay your head down. The scroll inside made a slight lump, but it was a familiar shape and you adjusted it until it felt comfortable. The satchel strap you tucked underneath, out of the way. The courtyard had grown quiet now, the last murmurs of conversation fading as the travelers settled into their own alcoves. You could hear the sound of someone coughing softly, a dry sound quickly stifled. A mule stamped its hoof on the stone outside the gate, the sound sharp and then gone. The water basin continued its endless gentle splashing, and the wind outside hummed against the stone walls like a distant voice. You lay on your back, looking up at the rectangle of sky visible above the courtyard, and you watched the stars grow brighter as the darkness deepened. There were so many stars, more than you ever saw in the lowlands, a dense scattering of light across the blackness. They seemed very far away, and at the same time they seemed close enough to touch, cold points of fire in the high, thin air. You closed your eyes, not to sleep, but to rest in the darkness behind your eyelids. Your body was heavy with the pleasant weariness of the day, your muscles slowly releasing the tension of the climb. You felt the subtle movement of your own breathing, the rise and fall of your chest, and you let your awareness drift along with it. The straw mat rustled softly beneath you each time you shifted, a quiet, papery sound. Beside you, in the next alcove, you could hear the slow, regular breathing of the merchant, already asleep, his breath a soft rhythm that blended with the splash of the water. In another alcove, the two men had stopped talking and were now silent, their presence marked only by an occasional rustle of straw. Time passed, how much you did not know. The oil lamps burned steadily, their flames unwavering, and the courtyard remained bathed in their dim, warm glow. The wind outside had dropped a little, or perhaps the walls of the caravanserai were simply doing their work, sheltering you from its full force. The night was cold, you could feel it pressing against the open archways, but here in your alcove, wrapped in your coat and lying on the straw mat, you were warm enough. The warmth of the soup still lingered in your stomach, a small, steady fire. After a while, you heard a new sound, distant and high, cutting through the murmur of the water and the wind. It was the cry of a night bird, somewhere out on the mountain slopes, a long, wavering call that rose and fell in pitch. You had heard this cry before, on other nights and other passes, and you recognized it as the voice of some kind of owl, though you had never seen the bird itself. The call came again, a little closer this time, and then a third time, farther away, moving across the darkness on silent wings. The sound was lonely but not sad, a wild note in the great quiet of the mountains. You listened to it until it faded completely, and then there was only the water and the wind and the breathing of the sleepers around you. You turned onto your side, pulling your coat more tightly around your shoulders. The satchel remained under your head, its presence a small reassurance, the seal still unbroken, the message still safe. You thought briefly of the road ahead, the long ridge path that would carry you onward in the morning, the descent into the forest, the market town that waited at the halfway point. But these thoughts were hazy, unfocused, drifting through your mind like clouds across the stars. You did not hold on to them. You let them pass, and you let your mind grow still, settling into the quiet awareness of the present moment, the smell of straw, the coolness of the stone, the soft rhythm of your own heart. In the courtyard, the water continued to splash, a sound that had been splashing for centuries and would splash for centuries more. The caravanserai held you in its ancient, patient embrace, a shelter built by hands long gone, a refuge for all who walked the mountain roads. And as the night deepened and the stars wheeled slowly overhead, you lay in the darkness, neither awake nor asleep, suspended in a perfect stillness that was the gift of the road and the reward of a day's long walking. The cry of the night bird did not return, but its echo remained, a faint wild thread woven into the fabric of the night, and you listened to the silence it left behind, until the silence itself became a kind of sleep. The first sign that morning was approaching came not as a sound or a light, but as a subtle shift in the air, a barely perceptible cooling that crept through the high stone walls of the caravanserai and settled over the sleeping forms in the alcoves. You felt it in your sleep, a faint disturbance that pulled you gently upward from the depths of rest, and by the time the first person stirred elsewhere in the courtyard, your eyes were already open, gazing up at the vaulted ceiling where the faintest wash of grey had begun to replace the absolute black. The oil lamps had long since burned out, their wicks drowned in the last of the oil, and the only illumination was the pale glow of the pre-dawn sky seeping through the high, arched windows. You lay still for a little while, as was your habit, allowing your body to remember itself piece by piece, the slight stiffness in your shoulders from sleeping on a straw mat, the residual warmth of the wool coat that you had used as an extra blanket, the cool, dry air on your face. The satchel was still beneath your head, its shape familiar against your cheek, and you could feel the outline of the scroll inside, unchanged, unbroken, waiting. Around you, the caravanserai was beginning its slow, quiet awakening. It was not a loud process. There were no calls or shouts, only the soft rustle of people gathering their belongings, the whisper of leather straps being tightened, the occasional low murmur of a greeting that was also a farewell. You sat up slowly, swinging your legs over the edge of the wooden platform, and you reached for your boots. The leather was cool and slightly stiff from the night chill, and you worked your feet into them with the patient, practiced motions of long habit. You laced them loosely at first, then tighter, the cord slipping through the eyelets with a soft hissing sound. Your water skin lay beside you, still half full from the spring you had found the previous evening, and you took a small sip, swishing the water around your mouth before swallowing. It was cold and tasted of the mountain, clean and sharp. The courtyard was coming to life now, though that phrase was too energetic for what was actually happening. It was more a gentle stirring, like the surface of a pond ruffled by the first breeze of the day. A merchant was folding his blankets in the alcove opposite, his movements slow and methodical. A young boy, perhaps his son, was leading a donkey toward the water trough, the animal's hooves making soft, hollow sounds on the stone pavement. The central basin reflected the lightening sky, a pale grey rectangle in the deeper grey of the courtyard. You stood up, straightened your coat, settled the satchel across your chest, and picked up your walking stick from where it leaned against the wall. The keeper of the caravanserais was already awake, as you knew he would be. He was a thin man with a quiet voice, and he stood near the main gate with a clay cup of something hot in his hands. He nodded to you as you approached, and you returned the nod. You had paid for your night's lodging the evening before, a few copper coins that covered the straw mat and the simple meal, so there was nothing to settle. The keeper gestured toward the gate, a small movement of his chin, and you understood that the gate was unlocked, that you could leave whenever you wished. You crossed the courtyard, your footsteps loud in the quiet space, and you pushed open the small door set into the larger gate. The hinges made no sound. They were well oiled and maintained for exactly this purpose, the quiet comings and goings of travelers at all hours. You stepped out onto the road, and the world was transformed. The caravanserai, so solid and enclosed, fell away behind you, and suddenly you were standing on the high pass with the whole sweep of the mountains stretching out in every direction. The sky was a pale milky grey, the color of water in a silver bowl, and a thin band of soft orange light glowed on the eastern horizon. The air was very cold, colder than you had expected, and it carried the clean, almost metallic scent of high altitudes and empty spaces. You could see your breath in small, brief clouds that vanished almost as soon as they formed, and you pulled your coat tighter, tucking your chin down into the collar. The road ahead was unlike the steep, winding track you had climbed the day before. It followed a long ridge that curved away to the north, a natural causeway between two deeper valleys. The ridge was broad and gently undulating, its surface covered with short, sun-bleached grass that had been cropped close by grazing animals. The road itself was a faint line, worn into the grass, two parallel tracks of bare earth with a strip of tougher vegetation between them. It was the kind of road that had not been built so much as simply worn into existence by the passage of feet and hooves over countless years. There were no steep ascents here, no sharp descents, just a slow rolling rhythm of small rises and gentle dips that would carry you along the spine of the mountain. You began to walk. The first few steps were always the hardest, the body protesting the transition from rest to motion, but within a minute you had found your rhythm again. The pace was different here, not the deliberate, measured climb of the previous day, but a looser, easier stride that covered ground without effort. The ridge road was kind to travelers. It asked only patience, not strength. Your walking stick tapped lightly on the packed earth, a steady, unhurried beat that seemed to match the slow pulse of the waking world. The sky continued to lighten, the grey gradually separating into layers of pale blue and soft pink, and the orange glow on the horizon intensified until it was a thin, brilliant line of gold. You walked eastward toward the rising sun, and your shadow stretched out behind you, impossibly long, a dark giant that lay across the grass and the rocks, its head and shoulders distorted by the uneven ground. You glanced back at it once or twice, amused by its strange, attenuated shape, and then you turned your attention forward again, letting the shadow follow as it would. The grass on either side of the road was the color of old straw, and it rustled softly in the morning breeze, a sound like the turning of ancient pages. Here and there, small hardy flowers grew among the grass, tiny white and yellow blooms that seemed too delicate for this harsh, windswept place. A few juniper bushes, low and sprawling, dotted the slopes below the ridge, their dark green foliage a stark contrast to the pale grass. The road was empty. This was the first thing you truly noticed after the cold and the light and the vastness of the view. There were no other travelers, no girthards, no farmers, no distant figures on the path ahead. You were alone on the ridge, a single moving point in the landscape that seemed to have no use for human beings. The solitude was not oppressive, it was rather a kind of spacious quiet that invited the mind to expand and slow down. You let your thoughts drift, not fixing on anything in particular, just noting the passing details of the world, the way a small bird hovered over the grass, its wings a blur, the way a lizard darted across a flat stone and vanished into a crack, the way the clouds, high and thin, moved almost imperceptibly across the sky. After some time, you came upon a stone marker. It stood at the side of the road, a rectangular block of rough-cut granite about waist-high, its surfaces weathered by centuries of wind and rain. You stopped to examine it, as you always did, running your fingers over the faint traces of carved letters that were now almost completely illegible. The inscription was in Ottoman Turkish, you knew, though you could not have read more than a word or two even if it had been clear. The marker had been placed here to guide travelers, to confirm that the road was the right road, and it had been doing its silent work for so long that the edges of the stone were rounded and soft, like old soap. You traced the shallow grooves of one letter, a curved shape that might have been a nun or a mim, and then you let your hand fall and continued on your way. The ridge road carried you along its undulating course, each small rise revealing a new vista that was almost identical to the last. The hills rolled away to the north in a series of low, rounded waves, their flanks covered with the same bleached grass, their summits bare and smooth. To the south, a deeper valley fell away into shadow, a dark cleft in the mountainside where the pines grew thick, and a stream glinted like a dropped thread of silver. You could not hear the stream from this height, but you knew it was there, and the knowledge was a quiet comfort. You adjusted the satchel strap, shifting the weight a fraction, and you walked on. The sun was fully up now, a pale gold disk that had cleared the horizon and was climbing steadily into the pale blue sky. Its light was still gentle, lacking the heavy heat of midday, and it fell across the ridge with a slanting, honey-colored glow that made the grass look almost luminous. The chill of the early morning had faded, replaced by a pleasant coolness that was neither too warm nor too cold. It was the ideal temperature for walking, and you felt your body respond with a kind of quiet gratitude, your muscles working smoothly, your breath coming easily and deep. You swung your arms in a natural, relaxed motion, the walking stick moving in counterpoint to your legs, and the satchel bumped gently against your hip with each step. To pass the time, you began to count your steps. It was an old technique, one you had learned from another courier many years ago, a man with a weathered face and a quiet voice who had told you that counting was the secret to long journeys. You did not count every step, of course. That would have been exhausting and counterproductive. Instead, you counted in groups of 100, keeping a running tally in the back of your mind, letting the numbers flow past without holding on to them. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, then another 10, then another, the decades accumulating like the beads on a string. When you reached 100, you let the number go, releasing it into the wind, and you began again. The counting was not a concentration but a rhythm, a gentle framework that gave structure to the empty hours and kept the mind from wandering too far. At some point, we lost count. It happened without your noticing, the numbers blurring into a wordless hum that was less of thought than a feeling, a sense of forward motion that required no articulation. You did not try to retrieve the lost count, you simply let it go and walked on, the rhythm of your feet taking over where the numbers had left off. The road continued, the grass continued, the sky continued, and you were a part of all of it, a small, moving element in a vast, still composition. A second stone marker appeared, this one more eroded than the first, its top worn into a smooth, rounded dome. You paused beside it and drank from your water skin, the water still cold from the night air. You ate a small piece of dried apricot, its surface leathery and dusted with a faint bloom of sugar, and you chewed it slowly, letting the sweetness dissolve on your tongue. The sun was higher now, and your shadow had shrunk from its long morning stretch into a more compact, human-sized shape that walked beside you like a dark twin. You watched it for a moment, noting how it moved exactly as you moved, a perfect mirror of your every gesture, and then you capped the waterskin and continued on. The monotony of the ridge was, in its own way, deeply soothing. There was nothing to react to, nothing to decide, nothing to plan. There was only the road and the walking, the unchanging panorama of grass and sky, the steady, hypnotic rhythm of your own breath and footsteps. You found that your mind had settled into a state that was not quite alert and not quite drowsy, a kind of floating awareness that observed the world without judging it. You noticed the way the wind made patterns in the grass, sweeping across the slopes in long, sighing waves. You noticed the way a hawk circled high above, its wings motionless, riding a thermal with an effortless grace. You noticed the way the stones on the path were arranged in a sort of natural pattern, the larger ones pushed to the edges by the passage of feet, the smaller ones crushed into the dirt. You noticed all these things and you let them go, and the road carried you onward. Hours passed. You could not have said how many, for time on the ridge moved differently, not in minutes and hours, but in the slow shifting of the sun across the sky and the gradual shortening and then lengthening of your shadow. You passed a third stone marker, this one so warm that it was barely more than a low grey stump, and you did not stop. You passed a patch of wild thyme that released its sharp herbal scent as your boots crushed it, and you breathed it in with quiet pleasure. You passed a small flock of sheep, far away on a distant slope, their white shapes like scattered pebbles against the brown grass, and you heard the faint silvery tinkle of their bells carried on the wind. A shepherd must have been somewhere nearby, but you did not see him, and you did not look for him. The road dipped into a shallow hollow, a broad, bowl-shaped depression where the grass grew a little greener and a few stunted wildflowers bloomed. At the bottom of the hollow, a tiny spring seeped from the ground, forming a small dark pool that was ringed with moss. You knelt by the pool and refilled your waterskin, the cold water trickling over your fingers, and you splashed a handful onto your face. The shock of the cold brought you back to full alertness for a moment, and you took the opportunity to look around more carefully, to take stock of your progress. The ridge continued ahead, rising slightly as it curved to the northwest, and in the far distance you could just make out the faint blue-grey shapes of higher mountains, the peaks that lay beyond this range. They were still many days away, not part of this journey, but their presence was a reminder that the world was larger than any single road, any single messenger. You stood up, brushed the dirt from your knees, and resumed walking. The hollow fell away behind you, and the ridge rose again, gently, almost imperceptibly, until you were once more on the open, wind-swept crest. The sun was past its zenith now, beginning its slow descent toward the western hills, and the light was taking on the first hints of the golden, late-afternoon quality that you had come to know so well. Your shadow began to stretch out again, longer with each passing minute, a dark, silent companion that grew and grew until it was once more a giant striding across the landscape. The road continued, empty and patient, and you continued with it, your body moving in the same steady rhythm it had maintained since dawn. The satchel was a familiar weight, the stick a familiar extension of your arm, the ridge a familiar path that unrolled beneath your feet with the slow, hypnotic inevitability of a dream. You did not think about the scroll. You did not think about the destination. You thought only of the next step, and the next, and the next, letting the numbers rise and fall in your mind like the slow breathing of the earth itself. And so the second day of your journey passed, in quiet and solitude, on the long, undulating road that ran along the spine of the mountain, carrying you ever onward through the calm, unhurried hours of the light. The rich road began to lose its grip on the high open world late in the morning, when the sun had climbed high enough to burn off the last of the chill, and the wind had shifted from its steady, persistent push to a gentler, more intermittent presence. You had been walking for hours along the undulating spine of the mountain, the grass on either side bleached to a pale straw, the sky a vast, empty blue, and the only sounds the rustle of the breeze and the rhythmic tap of your walking stick. The monotony had been a comfort, a long, slow meditation that asked nothing of you but the simple repetition of one foot after the other. But now the land was changing, and you could feel the change before you could see it, a subtle softening of the air, a faint increase in humidity, a new scent that drifted up from somewhere ahead. The road curved gently to the left, following the contour of a broad shoulder, and you saw for the first time the dark line of trees that marked the edge of the forest. It was not a sudden boundary, but a gradual transition, the open grassland giving way to scattered shrubs, and then to the first stunted pines, their trunks twisted and their branches sparse. Beyond them, the true forest began, a dense expanse of beech and hornbeam that stretched down the mountainside and filled the valley below like a green sea. The canopy, seen from above, was a mosaic of different greens, from the pale, almost yellow green of new leaves to the deep shadowed green of older growth, and it seemed to ripple slightly in the breeze, a slow breathing motion that was both vast and peaceful. You descended into the trees as the road narrowed once more, the wide grassy track of the ridge giving way to a stony path that wound between the trunks with a gentle, sinuous grace. The transition was immediate and complete. One moment you were walking under the open sky, the sun warm on your shoulders and the wind tugging at your coat, and the next you were enveloped in a cool green shade, the light dappled and broken by the canopy above. The ever-deft insulation tricks, from makeshift insulation tricks, earthy smell of moss and decaying leaves, a scent that was both ancient and alive. You breathed it in deeply, and it filled your lungs with a cool, clean moisture that was a welcome relief after the dry air of the heights. The road dropped steadily, following the natural slope of the mountain, but the descent was gentle, an easy sloping angle that required no effort to manage. Your muscles, which had been working steadily on the long, level ridge, now relaxed into the downward motion, and you felt a pleasant looseness spreading through your legs and back. You did not need to lean back or brace yourself. The gradient was so mild that you could walk almost as you had on the flat, your stride lengthening slightly, your weight shifting naturally onto your heels. The walking stick, which had been tapping a steady rhythm on the packed earth, now struck the stones with a softer, more muffled sound, the forest floor cushioning each impact with a layer of leaf litter and damp soil. The trees that surrounded you were tall and straight, their trunks smooth and grey, marked here and there with the dark horizontal scars of old branches long since fallen. Beech trees you recognized with their pale silvery bark and their branches that spread out in graceful sweeping curves, the new leaves a tender translucent green that glowed when the sunlight struck them. Among the beeches grew hornbeams, their trunks fluted and muscular, their leaves smaller and more serrated, creating a denser, darker shade. The two species mingled together in a harmonious partnership, their roots intertwining beneath the soil, their canopies weaving a living roof overhead. The light that filtered through this roof was soft and green, a submarine glow that shifted and danced as the branches moved in the breeze, creating patterns on the ground that were never still, never the same from one moment to the next. You walked through this shifting light with a quiet sense of wonder, though it was a familiar wonder, one you had experienced many times before on this very road. The forest had a way of making the world feel smaller and larger at the same time. Smaller because your vision was limited to the space between the trees. Larger because the trees themselves seemed to go on forever, their ranks stretching away into the dim distance on every side. You could no longer see the sky except in fragments, patches of blue that appeared and disappeared as the canopy shifted. The wind that had been your constant companion on the ridge was now only a distant murmur, a sound that moved through the upper branches with a soft, rushing sigh that never reached the ground. And then you heard the stream. It came to you gradually, a sound that had been there for some time before you consciously noticed it, a low, continuous murmur that blended with the rustle of the leaves and the soft crunch of your own footsteps. As the road continued its gentle descent, the sound grew clearer, separating itself from the background noise of the forest until it became a distinct presence, the running of water over stones. It was not a loud sound, not the roar of a mountain torrent, but a quiet, complex music made up of many small notes, the gurgle of a riffle, the plash of a tiny waterfall, the soft whisper of currents sliding around a rock. The sound had no pattern, no repeating rhythm. It was a constant improvisation, a liquid melody that changed from moment to moment, yet remained always the same. The road drew closer to the water, and soon you could see the stream through the trees, a ribbon of clear, quick-moving water that ran parallel to the path, separated from it by a narrow strip of ferns and mossy rocks. The stream was not wide, perhaps 4 or 5 paces across, and it was shallow enough that you could see every stone on its bed, each one rounded and smoothed by centuries of tumbling. The stones were of many colors, pale gray, dark brown, a rusty red that came from some mineral in the rock, and here and there a flash of white quartz that glinted when the sun struck it. The water flowed over and around these stones in a constant, sinuous motion, its surface wrinkling and smoothing, forming tiny eddies and ripples that caught the light and scattered it like broken glass. You walked alongside the stream for some time, the road and the water running together down the mountainside, 2 parallel paths that seemed to be in quiet conversation. The ferns that grew along the bank were tall and lush, their fronds unfurling in graceful arches, and they brushed against your coat as you passed, leaving tiny drops of moisture on the wool. The moss that covered the rocks was a vivid emerald green, thick and soft, and it seemed to glow in the dim light of the forest. You noticed small, delicate flowers growing in the damp soil near the water, tiny white blossoms with 5 petals, their stems so slender that they trembled at the slightest movement. You did not know their name, but you appreciated their presence, a small, quiet beauty in the deep shade. After a while, you came to a place where the road dipped down close to the stream, and a flat, grassy bank offered an inviting place to pause. You stepped off the path and walked the few paces to the water's edge, setting your walking stick against a tree and lowering yourself to a crouch. The bank was soft and mossy, and you could feel the coolness of the damp earth through the fabric of your trousers. The stream here was slightly wider, forming a small pool where the water slowed and deepened, its surface smooth and dark, reflecting the overhanging branches with perfect clarity. A few fallen leaves floated on the surface, drifting in slow circles, and a water strider skated across the stillness on its long, spindly legs, leaving tiny dimples that spread and vanished. You cupped your hands and dipped them into the water, feeling the cold bite of it against your skin. The cold was a shock, a bright, sharp sensation that chased away the drowsy warmth of the walk and brought you fully into the present moment. You lifted your hands and splashed the water onto your face, once, twice, 3 times, each splash a small, invigorating burst that left your skin tingling and fresh. The water ran down your neck and soaked into the collar of your shirt, and you did not mind. You drank a few mouthfuls directly from your cupped palms, the water tasting of moss and rock and the deep, clean essence of the mountain. It was the best water you had ever tasted, you thought, though you had thought the same thing at every spring and stream along the road. You remained by the pool for a little while, your eyes wandering over the surface of the water, watching the play of light and shadow, and it was then that you noticed the dragonfly. It hovered over a sunlit patch of the pool, its long, slender body a brilliant, iridescent blue that seemed to glow against the dark water. Its forewings were a transparent blur, moving so fast that they were almost invisible, and yet the insect itself hung perfectly motionless in the air, as if suspended by an invisible thread. It darted suddenly to the left, then to the right, its movements quick and precise, and then it returned to its original position and hovered again. You watched it for a long moment, fascinated by its stillness and its speed, by the way it seemed to exist in a different kind of time than you did. Then, suddenly as it had appeared, it darted away and vanished into the shadows, and the pool was still once more. You rose from your crouch, your knees stiff from the position, and you stretched your arms above your head with a slow, luxurious motion. The satchel shifted against your hip as you moved, and you adjusted the strap without thinking, a gesture that had become as automatic as breathing. You picked up your walking stick, took one last look at the quiet pool, and stepped back onto the road. The stream remained beside you, its music a constant companion, and you resumed your descent through the forest. The road continued to drop, the angle still gentle, the surface still stony and uneven, but easy to walk on. The beeches and hornbeams grew taller and thicker here, their trunks so wide that you could not have wrapped your arms around them, and the canopy above was so dense that the light at ground level was a perpetual twilight. The air grew cooler and damper, and you could see a fine mist hanging among the trees, a soft grey haze that blurred the distant trunks and gave the forest a dreamlike quality. The smell of moss and decay was stronger here, a rich fertile scent that spoke of the slow, patient work of the earth, the breaking down of leaves and wood into dark, crumbly soil. The forest floor, you noticed, was littered with the husks of last year's beech nuts. They lay scattered across the path, and among the ferns, small triangular cases with spiny outer shells that had split open to release the nuts inside. Most of the husks were empty, their interiors hollow and dry, but here and there you saw a whole nut still nestled in its case, a smooth brown kernel that the squirrels and birds had somehow missed. You kicked idly at a cluster of the husks as you walked, sending them skittering across the stones with a dry, rustling sound. The motion was unthinking, a small, childlike gesture that you did not examine or judge. You simply did it, and the husks scattered and the stream continued to murmur beside you. You walked on, and the forest opened up slightly, the trees spreading apart to create small sunlit glades where the undergrowth grew thick and tangled. Wild raspberries grew in these glades, their canes arching out over the path, and you paused to pick a few of the dark, ripe berries. They were small but intensely sweet, their juice staining your fingers a deep purple, and you ate them slowly, savoring the burst of flavor. A bird sang somewhere in the canopy above, a clear fluting song that fell through the air like drops of water, and you listened to it until it stopped, leaving behind a silence that was somehow richer than before. The afternoon was advancing, and the quality of the light was changing. The sun, invisible beyond the canopy, had begun its slow slide toward the western horizon, and the light that filtered through the leaves took on a warmer, deeper hue. The green of the forest softened into gold, the shadows lengthened and deepened, and the trunks of the beeches glowed with a soft, amber radiance. It was the hour when the world seemed to hold its breath, suspended between the activity of the day and the stillness of the coming night. You walked through this golden hour with a quiet sense of gratitude, your body moving easily, your mind at peace. The stream, which had been your companion for so long, began to drift away from the road, its course diverging as the valley widened. The sound of the water grew fainter, the liquid music fading into a distant murmur, and then it was gone, replaced by the soft, dry rustle of the trees. You missed it for a moment, that constant soothing presence, but the forest had its own music, and you soon attuned yourself to the new rhythm. The road continued its gentle descent, and you followed it with the same steady, unhurried pace you had maintained all day. As the light continued to dim, you began to think, in a vague, unfocused way, about the town that lay ahead. It was the halfway point of your journey, a place where you would rest for the night and have your satchel inspected by a clerk with ink-stained fingers. You had been there before, and you could picture it in your mind. The cobbled lanes, the whitewashed houses with their blue window frames, the great plane tree in the square. But these thoughts were distant and hazy, and you did not hold on to them. They drifted through your consciousness like the fallen leaves on the stream, and you let them go, returning your attention to the simple physical reality of walking. The forest floor sloped gently downward, and you could feel the descent in the way your weight shifted forward, in the way your heels struck the ground just a fraction harder. The trees began to thin out, the dense stands of beech and hornbeam giving way to more open woodland, where oaks and chestnuts grew among the grey trunks. The light was softer now, the golden glow deepening into a rich amber twilight, and you could see, through the gaps in the trees, the first hint of the valley below. It was a broad, cultivated basin, a patchwork of fields and orchards that looked, from this height, like a carefully woven carpet of greens and browns, and the pale dusty white of roads and buildings. You paused at a place where the road made a sharp bend, and you looked down at the valley with quiet appreciation. A thin haze hung over the fields, the smoke of cooking fires rising from 100 chimneys, and the distant sound of a bell, perhaps from a church or a mosque, drifted up to you on the still air. The town was there, somewhere among the clustered roofs, but it was still too far away to make out any details. You would reach it soon enough, before full dark, and there would be an inn with a simple room, a meal of rice and vegetables, a basin of water to wash the dust from your feet. The thought was a pleasant one, and you held it for a moment before letting it go. You resumed your walk, and the road led you out of the forest at last, the trees falling away on either side as you emerged onto the open slopes above the valley. The sky was a pale, washed blue, streaked with ribbons of pink and gold, and the air was warm and still, carrying the scent of cut hay and distant wood smoke. The road widened again, becoming a proper track with stone edging and deep wheel ruts, and you could see the first houses of the town ahead, their whitewashed walls glowing softly in the fading light. The forest was behind you now, its cool green shade a memory, and the stream was somewhere far below, still running, still singing its quiet, wordless song. You walked on toward the town, your body tired in a pleasant way, your mind quiet and clear, and the satchel still secure against your hip, its seal unbroken, its message waiting to be delivered to a place that was still many miles and many days away. The forest released you gently, its edge unraveling into a scattering of solitary oaks and wild chestnuts that stood like sentinels at the boundary between the wild and the cultivated. The road, which had been a narrow track of packed earth and stone, widened again and smoothed into a proper thoroughfare, its surface graded and edged with rough-cut curbstones that had been worn to a soft roundness by generations of cartwheels. You walked out from under the last of the trees and into the open valley, and the late afternoon sun, now hanging low above the western ridges, washed over you in a flood of warm, golden light. The shadows were long and soft, and the air had the particular stillness of early evening, a calm that seemed to settle over the land like a held breath. The valley spread before you, a broad basin of fields and orchards and small clustered settlements, and there, perhaps a mile ahead and a little below, was the market town. It was the first significant gathering of buildings you had seen since leaving the caravanserais, and its presence, even from a distance, was a quiet comfort. The town was not large. It was the sort of place that travelers passed through on their way to somewhere else, a waypoint, a place of rest and small transactions. Its buildings were low and mostly whitewashed, their flat roofs and terracotta tiles catching the angled light, and here and there a cypress tree rose up like a dark green flame against the pale walls. A thin haze of wood smoke hung over the rooftops, the product of many cooking fires being lit for the evening meal, and it softened the outlines of the town, giving it a gentle, dreamlike quality. You walked toward it with the steady, unhurried pace that it carried you through the long day, your legs moving automatically, your mind quiet and open. The road descended gradually into the valley, passing through a belt of olive groves where the trees were ancient and massive, their trunks gnarled into fantastic shapes, their leaves a soft silver grey. A few farmers were working among the trees, gathering fallen branches for firewood, and they looked up as you passed and then looked away again, their curiosity mild and fleeting. A dog trotted along the edge of the grove, its nose to the ground, and it paid you no attention at all. The outskirts of the town appeared first as a scattering of small houses and garden plots, their boundaries marked by low stone walls topped with dried brush. Chickens scratched in the dust beside the road, and a goat bleated from somewhere behind a wall, its voice high and plaintive. The smell of the town reached you before the sight of its center, a blend of wood smoke and cooking oil, of sun-warmed stone, and the faint, sharp tang of animals. It was not an unpleasant smell. It was the smell of human habitation, of daily life continuing in its ordinary, unhurried way. You entered the town proper on a cobbled lane, the stones set into the ground in a careful pattern, their surfaces polished smooth by the passage of countless feet and hooves. The lane was narrow, just wide enough for a small cart, and the houses on either side rose 2 stories, their upper floors jutting out slightly over the street, supported by wooden beams. The walls of the houses were whitewashed, a clean, bright white that reflected the evening light, and around every window and doorway the wooden frames were painted a soft, faded blue, a color that you had seen before in many towns and that always gave you a quiet sense of welcome. The blue was the color of protection, of peaceful sleep, of a tradition so old that no one remembered its origin. The lane led you deeper into the town, curving gently between the houses, and you passed a few people going about their evening business. An old woman sat on a low stool outside her door, shelling beans into a clay bowl, her fingers moving with the quick, automatic precision of long practice. A young boy carried a bundle of kindling on his back, the sticks tied together with a piece of rope. A cat sat on a windowsill, washing its paw with slow, meticulous care. None of these people spoke to you, but their presence was a quiet reassurance, a reminder that the world was full of ordinary moments unfolding in their own time. The lane widened suddenly, and you found yourself at the edge of the market square. The square was the heart of the town, a broad, open space paved with the same smooth cobbles, and in its exact center grew a plane tree of enormous size. The tree was ancient, its trunk so thick that it would have taken 3 or 4 people to encircle it, and its bark was a patchwork of pale gray and soft brown, peeling away in places to reveal the smooth new skin beneath. Its branches spread out in all directions, thick and muscular, and they supported a vast canopy of broad, hand-shaped leaves that cast a deep, dappled shade over almost the entire square. Benches of worn stone had been placed around the base of the tree, and a few people sat there in the cool shadow, talking quietly or simply resting, their faces turned toward the last of the sunlight. Around the square, the buildings were taller and more substantial than the houses on the lane. A small mosque with a single slender minaret stood on the north side, its whitewashed walls glowing in the evening light, and beside it was a building with a wide arched doorway that you recognized as a public bath. On the west side, a row of shops and workshops lined the square, a coppersmith, a tailor, a seller of dried goods whose wares were displayed in open sacks outside the door. Most of the shops were closing for the day, their shutters being drawn and their owners sweeping the pavement with short, brisk strokes of a broom. The sound of the brooms was a soft, rhythmic swishing that blended with the murmur of conversation and the distant, drowsy cooing of pigeons. Your destination was not the shops or the mosque, but a building on the east side of the square, a 2-story stone structure with a modest arched entrance and a small barred window on the ground floor. This was the administrative kiosk, the local office of the imperial courier system, where messengers like yourself were required to register their passage and have their documents inspected. You had been here before, on previous journeys, and the building was as familiar to you as any way station on the road. You crossed the square, stepping around a cart laden with melons that had been parked near the fountain, and you pushed open the wooden door of the kiosk. The interior was dim and cool, a single room with a high ceiling and a floor of polished stone. A long wooden counter divided the room in half, and behind it sat the clerk. He was a thin man of middle years, with ink-stained fingers and a pair of spectacles perched low on his nose, and he was writing in a large ledger with a slow, careful hand. The nib of his pen made a faint scratching sound as it moved across the paper, a sound that was the only noise in the quiet room. He looked up as you entered, his eyes blinking behind the spectacles, and he gave you a small, professional nod. You approached the counter and set your satchel upon it, unbuckling the strap with practiced fingers. The clerk set down his pen, blotted the page he had been writing on with a square of clean cloth, and turned his attention to you. He did not speak, and neither did you. There was no need for unnecessary words. He reached into the satchel and withdrew the scroll, holding it carefully by its edges so as not to disturb the seal. He examined the seal with a brief, professional glance, noting the tura and the condition of the wax, and then he opened a different ledger, a smaller one bound in dark leather, and made a brief entry. The entry you knew would record the date, the seal number, your name or a description of you, and the time of your arrival. It was a simple piece of bureaucracy, a small cog in the vast administrative machinery of the empire, and you watched the clerk's hand move across the page with the same quiet, methodical strokes. When he had finished, he returned the scroll to the satchel and pushed it back across the counter. He did not stamp anything. There was no receipt to give. He simply made a small mark on a separate slip of paper and handed it to you, a chit that confirmed your passage through this station. You tucked the chit into an inner pocket of your vest and gave the clerk a brief nod, which he returned, and then you were done. You stepped back out into the square, and the light had shifted perceptibly in the short time you had been inside. The sun had dipped below the rooftops, and the sky above the square was a deep, soft blue shading to gold and pink near the horizon. The plane tree was now a dark silhouette against the glowing sky, its leaves rustling gently in the evening breeze. A few more people had gathered on the benches, and a man was lighting the oil lamps that hung from brackets on the walls of the buildings, touching a long taper to each wick in turn. The flames caught and steadied, small bright points of light that cast warm pools on the cobbles below. You walked across the square, past the plane tree and the fountain, and you began to look for an inn. There were several in the town, and you knew them all, but you had a preference for one in particular, a small establishment on a side street off the square, run by a quiet woman and her husband. The inn was not grand. It offered simple rooms with a bed and a basin, a meal in the evening, and a quiet courtyard where you could sit and listen to the sounds of the town. It was, in its own unassuming way, the most restful place you knew. You found the inn on a narrow lane just off the square, its entrance marked by a wooden sign that hung from an iron bracket, the painted letters faded, but still legible. The door stood open, and you stepped into a small, low-ceiling common room. The floor was made of packed earth covered with woven rush mats, and a few low tables and stools were arranged around the walls. A clay oven in the corner radiated a gentle warmth, and the air smelled of baking bread and simmering vegetables. The innkeeper's wife, a round-faced woman with a kind expression, was wiping down one of the tables with a damp cloth. She looked up when you entered and smiled, a small, welcoming smile that asked no questions. You asked for a room, and she nodded, wiping her hands on her apron and reaching for a key from a hook on the wall. She led you up a narrow staircase to a small room on the second floor, a simple space with a wooden bed covered by a clean, rough blanket, a small table with a clay basin and a pitcher of water, and a window that looked out over the lane below. The walls were whitewashed, and the floor was made of smooth, dark wood that creaked faintly under your feet. You thanked her, and she left you with a quiet word about the evening meal, which would be served in the common room whenever you were ready. You set your satchel on the bed, leaned your walking stick against the wall, and sat down with a long, slow exhale. The journey of the day was complete, and the weight of it settled over you like a heavy, comfortable blanket. You removed your boots, placing them neatly beside the door, and you poured water from the pitcher into the basin. The water was cool, not cold, and you washed your face and hands slowly, scrubbing away the dust and sweat of the road. Then you sat on the edge of the bed and lifted one foot into the basin, washing it with the same slow, methodical care. The water turned slightly cloudy with dust, and the sensation of it on your tired skin was deeply soothing. You dried your feet with a small rough towel that hung on a peg, and then you sat for a moment, simply breathing, listening to the quiet sounds of the inn. It was then that you noticed the loose thread on your satchel strap. It was a small thing, a single thread that had worked its way free from the stitching near the buckle, and it curled up from the leather like a tiny, questing tendril. You reached into your vest pocket and found the small sewing kit you always carried, a bone needle and a length of waxed thread wrapped around a slip of card. You threaded the needle with the ease of long practice, and you began to mend the loose stitch, working the needle through the leather with slow, precise motions. The work was simple and repetitive, and it gave your hands something to do while your mind drifted. The thread pulled tight, the needle slid through, the stitch settled into place, and when you were done the strap was whole again, the loose thread trimmed away. You tucked the sewing kit back into your pocket and set the satchel aside. The evening meal was served a short while later. You descended the stairs to the common room, which was now lit by a few oil lamps and occupied by a handful of other travelers. They sat at separate tables, eating quietly, their conversations low and sporadic. You found a stool near the window, and the innkeeper's wife brought you a bowl of rice and stewed vegetables, along with a piece of fresh flatbread and a small dish of olives. The vegetables were soft and savory, cooked with oil and a hint of dried herbs, and the rice was fluffy and warm. You ate slowly, as you always did, savoring each bite, feeling the food restore the energy that the long walk had spent. While you ate, the town's evening sounds drifted in through the open window. The call to prayer had begun, a single voice rising from the minaret, melodic and worn, its notes bending and stretching in the quiet air. The voice was not loud, but it carried far, floating over the rooftops in the square, and you paused with your spoon halfway to your mouth to listen. The call was a familiar sound, a thread of sound that wove through the fabric of the evening, and it had a calming, anchoring quality that you had always appreciated. When it ended, there was a moment of silence, and then the ordinary sounds resumed. The distant hammering of the coppersmith finishing a last piece of work, the laughter of children playing in a courtyard, the low murmur of conversation from the square. You finished your meal and sat by the window for a little while longer, watching the last light fade from the sky and the stars begin to appear. The air was cool now, and you could smell the faint sweetness of night-blooming jasmine from somewhere nearby. The town was settling into its night rhythm, the streets emptying, the lamps burning steady, and a deep quiet was descending over everything. When you finally rose and climbed the stairs to your room, you felt a profound sense of peace, a quiet contentment that had nothing to do with arrival or achievement and everything to do with the simple, ordinary act of being alive in a world that was, for this moment, perfectly still. You lay down on the bed, the rough blanket pulled up to your chin, and you listened to the silence. The satchel rested on the table beside you, the scroll safe inside, the seal still unbroken. The window was open a crack, and you could hear the soft rustle of the plane tree leaves in the square, a gentle, whispering sound that seemed to be saying something you could almost understand. You closed your eyes, and the sounds of the town blurred together into a single soothing hum, and you let yourself drift, not sleeping yet but resting in that quiet space between waking and dreams, where the road was still and the night was long and nothing was required of you but rest. The morning in the market town began softly, with the first grey light filtering through the narrow window of your room and the distant, tentative call of a rooster somewhere in the back gardens. You woke slowly, your body still heavy with the deep rest of the night, and you lay for a while under the rough blanket, listening to the sounds of the inn coming to life around you. Footsteps moved quietly in the corridor outside, a door opened and closed with a soft thud, and from the common room below you could hear the clink of clay cups and the low murmur of voices. The inn was stirring, and soon you would stir with it. You sat up and swung your legs over the side of the bed, the wooden frame creaking gently under your weight. The air in the room was cool and still, carrying the faint clean scent of the whitewashed walls. You reached for your clothing, which you had folded the night before and placed on the stool beside the bed, and you dressed with the same slow, methodical care that had become the rhythm of your journey. The cotton shirt settled over your shoulders, the wool vest buttoned up the front, the heavy coat pulled on last and fastened loosely at the collar. Your boots, which you had polished with a scrap of cloth before sleeping, were dry and supple, and you laced them with fingers that moved automatically, the motion so familiar that they required no thought. You gathered your belongings, the water skin, refilled from the inn cistern the night before, a fresh bundle of flatbread and a small cloth pouch of dried figs that the innkeeper's wife had pressed into your hands as you had gone to bed, the satchel with its scroll and its mended strap, and your walking stick still leaning in the corner where you had left it. You settled the satchel across your chest, adjusted the strap so that it lay comfortably, and took one last look around the room to make sure you had left nothing behind. The room was bare as you had found it, the blanket smoothed on the bed, the basin empty, the window open just a crack. You closed the door behind you and descended the narrow stairs to the common room. The innkeeper's wife was there as you had known she would be, setting out bowls of thick yogurt and plates of fresh bread on the low tables. She looked up as you entered and gave you the same kind, wordless smile she had given you the night before. You returned a smile and accepted the small cup of strong, dark tea that she offered, drinking it standing by the door while the warmth of it spread through your chest. The tea was bitter and hot, and it cleared the last traces of sleep from your mind. When you had finished, you set the cup on the counter, offered a quiet word of thanks, and stepped out into the lane. The town was just beginning to wake. The cobbled lane, which had been empty and silent the night before, was now dotted with people moving slowly about their morning tasks. A man led a donkey laden with sacks of grain toward the mill, the animal's hooves clopping steadily on the stones. A woman swept the threshold of her house with a short broom, the bristles making a soft, rhythmic scratching sound. The sky above was a pale, milky blue, and a few faint stars still lingered in the highest reaches, reluctant to fade. The air was cool and fresh, carrying the scent of baking bread from somewhere nearby, and you breathed it in deeply as you walked toward the square. The great plane tree stood in the center of the square as it had stood for centuries, its leaves rustling softly in the morning breeze. A few old men were already gathered on the stone benches, their hands wrapped around cups of tea, their conversation a low, unhurried drone. The shops around the square were still shuttered, but the coppersmith's workshop was open, and you could hear the faint, ringing tap of a hammer on metal from within. The mosque's minaret caught the first rays of the rising sun, its pale stone turning a soft, rosy gold. You crossed the square without pausing, your footsteps echoing briefly on the cobbles, and you found the road that led out of the town and toward the mountains. The road on the far side of the town was different from the one that had brought you there. It was narrower, for one thing, and it climbed almost immediately, the gentle flatness of the valley giving way to a definite upward slope. The surface was paved with flat stones laid in a rough pattern, their edges worn smooth, and on either side the land rose in a series of terraces that stepped up the mountainside like a giant staircase. These were the terrace fields, and they were the reason this road existed, the reason the town existed, the reason generations of farmers had carved a living from the steep and stony slopes. You began to climb, and the view behind you opened up almost at once. The town, which had seemed so substantial when you were in its lanes, began to shrink and simplify, its buildings merging into a single cluster of white and terracotta, the plane tree a small green dot in the center of the square. Beyond the town, the valley floor stretched away in a patchwork of fields and orchards, and beyond that, hazy with distance, were the dark lines of the forest you had walked through the day before. You paused at the first switchback and looked back at the view, your breathing deep and even, your hands resting on the top of your walking stick. The town looked peaceful from up here, a quiet, orderly place going about its quiet, orderly business. You turned and continued to climb. The terrace fields were the work of countless hands over countless years. They rose on both sides of the road in a series of long, narrow platforms, each one supported by a dry stone wall that had been built without mortar. The stones fitted together with a precision that seemed almost miraculous. The walls were old, some of them ancient, their surfaces covered with lichen and small, tenacious plants that rooted in the cracks. They varied in height, some no taller than your knee, others rising above your head, and they followed the contours of the mountain with a graceful, sinuous logic that made them seem like a natural part of the landscape rather than a human imposition. On the terraces themselves, crops grew in neat, orderly rows. Barley and wheat were the most common, their stalks a pale green gold that rippled in the breeze, the seed heads just beginning to form and fill. Between the grain fields were smaller plots of vegetables, broad beans with their black and white flowers, chickpeas with their delicate feathery leaves, and rows of onions whose green tops stood up straight like tiny spears. The soil on the terraces was dark and rich, carefully tended, and you could see the evidence of recent work everywhere. The neat furrows of a hoe, the small piles of weeds that had been pulled and left to dry, the wooden tools leaning against the walls, waiting for their owners to return. The road climbed through the terraces in a series of gentle zigzags, each switchback offering a slightly different view of the mountain and the valley below. The angle of the climb was steady but not punishing, a gradient that allowed you to maintain a constant pace without strain. Your breath came deeper now, and you could feel the muscles in your calves and thighs working with a pleasant, measured effort. The walking stick tapped on the stone pavement with a sound that was sharper and brighter than the soft crunch of the forest path, and the rhythm of it helped you keep your pace steady. As you climbed, you became aware of the sound of water. It was a soft, trickling murmur that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, and it took you a moment to locate its source. Then you saw the channels, narrow stone-lined waterways that ran along the edges of the terraces, carrying water from one level to the next. The water moved slowly, almost lazily, its surface smooth and dark, and it made a gentle liquid music as it flowed over small stones and around the roots of plants. The channels were part of an intricate irrigation system that distributed water from a spring higher up the mountain, and they had been built with the same care and precision as the terrace walls themselves. Small sluice gates, no bigger than your hand, allowed the farmers to control the flow, directing the water to whatever field needed it most. You stopped at one of these sluice gates to drink from your water skin and to rest for a moment. The gate was a simple wooden board set into a groove in the stone, and a thin sheet of water spilled over its top edge, catching the sunlight and breaking it into tiny rainbows. You knelt beside the channel and dipped your fingers into the water, feeling its coolness, and then you sat back on your heels and looked out at the terraced landscape. It was a view of extraordinary order and beauty, the green strips of the fields alternating with the grey lines of the walls, the whole pattern repeating itself up the mountainside until it faded into the rocky heights above. A movement caught your eye, and you turned to see an old man working on a section of the terrace wall about 20 paces away. He was repairing a place where the stones had shifted, perhaps from the weight of winter snow or the slow pressure of the earth behind them. He worked slowly, carefully, his movements economical and precise. He would select a stone from a pile beside him, turn it over in his hands to find the best fit, and then set it into the wall with a gentle, almost tender pressure. Then he would choose another stone and another, each one finding its place in the ancient mortarless structure. He was so absorbed in his work that he did not notice you watching, or if he did, he gave no sign. You rose from your crouch and walked over to him, your footsteps loud on the stony path. He looked up as you approached, his face weathered and brown, his eyes a pale faded blue that seemed to hold the light of the sky. He gave you a small nod, and you returned it, and you offered a single word of greeting, the traditional peace that travelers and strangers exchange. He answered in kind, his voice a low, gravelly rumble, and then he turned back to his wall. You stood for a moment watching him work, the silence between you comfortable and undemanding. Then you gave another nod, which he acknowledged with a slight lift of his chin, and you continued on your way up the road. The sun was well up now, and the heat was beginning to build, though at this altitude it was still pleasant, a gentle warmth rather than the heavy, pressing heat of the lowlands. The light fell across the terraces in long, slanting bands, illuminating the green of the crops and the grey of the stones with a clarity that made every detail stand out. You could see individual grains of soil on the path, individual leaves on the barley stalks, individual threads of moss on the terrace walls. The world seemed sharp and vivid, as if you were seeing it through a newly cleaned window. You climbed on, and the road continued its steady, switchback progress up the mountainside. With each turn, the town below grew smaller and more distant, its details blurring into the general pattern of the valley. You could no longer see the individual buildings or the plane tree. You could only see the pale cluster of the town against the darker green of the fields and the silver thread of the river beyond. A hawk circled high overhead, its wings motionless, riding a thermal with an effortless grace that you watched with quiet admiration. The bird made a slow, spiraling ascent, rising higher and higher until it was just a dark speck against the blue, and then it wheeled away to the north and vanished. The walking on a full stomach, after the good meal and the deep sleep of the inn, brought a pleasant drowsiness that settled over you like a thin veil. It was not the heavy drowsiness of exhaustion, but a light, floating sensation, a softening of the edges of your awareness. You found yourself daydreaming as you walked, your mind drifting from one gentle, unfocused thought to another, none of them urgent, none of them demanding attention. You thought about the old man and his wall, the way his hands had moved among the stones with such quiet certainty. You thought about the water in the channels flowing endlessly down from the spring, doing its silent work. You thought about the scroll in your satchel, and for a moment you tried to picture the hands that had written it, the desk where it had been sealed, the words that lay hidden inside. But the image would not form, and you let it go, returning instead to the simple rhythm of your steps. The terrace fields continued for a long time, rising up the mountain in their orderly, patient way. The crops changed as you climbed, the wheat and barley giving way to hardier plants, lentils with their delicate trailing stems, chickpeas with their small pale flowers, and rows of a plant you did not recognize with thick grey-green leaves that seemed to hug the ground. The terrace walls were lower here, the soil thinner, and the whole landscape had a more rugged, marginal quality, as if each terrace had been won from the mountain at great cost and could be lost again at any moment. And yet the walls held, and the crops grew, and the water flowed in its channels, and the world continued in its slow, unhurried way. The sun climbed to its zenith and began its gradual descent, and the light changed from the bright clear gold of midday to the softer, deeper gold of afternoon. Your shadow, which had been a small, compact shape directly beneath you, began to stretch out again, pointing the way up the mountain like a dark arrow. You loosened the collar of your shirt without breaking stride, feeling the sun warm on the back of your neck, and you took a long drink from your water skin, the liquid still cool from the mountain spring. The drowsiness persisted, a gentle floating sensation that made the miles melt away, and you walked on through the golden afternoon, your body moving with the effortless mechanical precision of long practice. By late afternoon, the terraces began to thin out. The walls became fewer and farther between, the fields smaller and more scattered, and the road straightened as the gradient eased. You were approaching the upper limit of cultivation, the place where the mountain became too steep and too rocky for even the most determined farmer. The crops gave way to wild grass and low scrub, and the irrigation channels disappeared, their water returning to the earth from which it had come. Ahead, you could see the road leveling out onto a high, open plateau, a vast wind-swept expanse that stretched away to the horizon. The terrace fields were behind you now, their quiet, orderly beauty, a memory, and the next stage of the journey was waiting. You adjusted the satchel strap, felt the familiar weight of the scroll against your hip, and walked on toward the plateau, your footsteps steady and slow, your mind calm and clear, the mountains silent and patient all around you. The road lifted you out of the last of the terrace fields and onto the plateau so gradually that you hardly noticed the transition. One moment you were walking between the grey stone walls with their neat rows of lentils and chickpeas, and the next the walls had fallen away and the cultivated earth had given way to a vast open expanse of gravel and thin soil that stretched out before you in every direction. The plateau was a world unto itself, high and flat and exposed, a place where the sky seemed larger than anywhere else you had ever been. You stopped at the edge of it, where the last terrace wall crumbled into the stony ground, and you looked out across the emptiness with a quiet sense of entering a different kind of landscape. The vegetation here was sparse and low, nothing like the lush forests or the orderly fields you had left behind. Low, cushion-shaped shrubs grew in scattered clumps, their branches dense and wiry, their leaves small and grey-green, adapted to the constant wind and the thin, dry soil. They hugged the ground as if afraid of being torn away, and their shapes were rounded and compact, sculpted by the endless pressure of the air. Between the shrubs, the ground was covered with a fine, pale gravel that crunched underfoot, interspersed with patches of bare, cracked earth and the occasional tuft of coarse, yellowed grass. Scattered thistles grew here and there, their spiny leaves a dusty purple-green, their flower-heads still tightly closed and waiting for a season that seemed very far away. And there was the wind. It had been with you throughout your journey, a companion on the ridge and a whisper in the forest. But here on the plateau it was a different presence entirely. It was not violent, not a storm or a gale, but it was constant, a steady, unrelenting pressure that pushed against you from the west with a low, humming sound that never stopped. The wind on the plateau had a voice, a deep, resonant note that filled the air and vibrated faintly in your chest, and it carried with it the clean, dry scent of stone and distance. You could feel it pressing against your clothes, tugging at the hem of your coat, ruffling your hair, and you leaned into it slightly, adjusting your balance to meet its quiet force. You began to walk, and the road, which had been a clear and well-defined track through the terraces, became a faint line drawn across the gravel. It was still visible, still followable, but it was a subtler thing now, a slight depression in the stony ground, a strip where the gravel was finer and more compacted, where the cushioned shrubs had been worn away by the passage of feet. The road had been here for a long time, you could see that, but the plateau did not yield easily to human marks. The wind and the weather worked constantly to erase what was written on its surface, and the road had to be re-walked, re-remembered by each traveller who crossed it. You walked with a steady, unhurried pace, the same rhythm that had carried you through all the miles and all the days of your journey. The ground was level, or nearly so, and the walking was easy, though the wind made it feel like more of an effort than it actually was. You leaned forward slightly, your coat billowing out behind you, and you planted your walking stick firmly with each step, feeling its iron tip bite into the gravel. The satchel swung gently against your hip, a familiar, reassuring weight, and you could feel the shape of the scroll inside, still whole, still sealed, still waiting. The plateau stretched on in all directions, and you felt very small upon it. There were no trees, no structures, no other travelers, no signs of human life at all, except the faint line of the road itself. The only living things were the cushioned shrubs and the thistles, and the occasional flash of a small brown bird that would burst from the undergrowth and fly away low and fast, disappearing into the distance. The birds were the only creatures that seemed to thrive here, and you wondered, in a distant, idle way, what they found to eat among the sparse vegetation and the wind-scoured stones. But the question did not demand an answer, and you let it drift away on the moving air. Above you, the sky was immense. It was a pale washed blue, the color of old ceramic tiles, and it was filled with clouds. The clouds were high and thin, the kind of clouds that form at great altitudes, and they moved slowly across the dome of the sky in long parallel bands. Their shadows followed them across the plateau, vast, dark shapes that slid over the gravel and the shrubs with a smooth, silent motion. You watched the shadows as you walked, noting how they changed the color of the ground from pale gray to deep brown, how they cooled the air for a moment as they passed over you, and then how the sun returned, warm and bright, when the shadow had moved on. The shadows were like slow, silent creatures, patient and unhurried, migrating across the plateau on some ancient, unknowable journey of their own. You walked through the morning and into the afternoon, and the plateau did not change. It was a landscape of profound monotony, the same gravel, the same shrubs, the same thistles, the same wind, repeating themselves endlessly in every direction. The monotony, you found, was not tedious, but deeply soothing. It asked nothing of you, demanded no attention, presented no surprises. It was simply there, a vast open emptiness that you moved through at your own slow pace, and the simplicity of it allowed your mind to settle into a state of quiet, floating awareness. You were not thinking exactly, and you were not asleep. You were somewhere in between, a place where the only things that existed were the wind and the gravel and the steady rhythm of your own footsteps. After a long time, you stopped to rest and to eat. There was no shade on the plateau, no tree or rock to shelter under, so you simply sat down on a flat patch of gravel beside the road, your back to the wind, and you took out the last of your provisions. The innkeeper's wife had given you a hard-boiled egg, its shell still intact, and a small handful of dried apricots, and a piece of flatbread wrapped in a clean cloth. You set these things out on your knee, arranging them with the slow, deliberate care of someone who has all the time in the world. You peeled the egg slowly, cracking the shell against a stone and picking away the fragments with your fingernails. The shell came away in small, brittle pieces, and underneath it the egg was smooth and white, still faintly warm from being carried against your body. You ate it in small bites, chewing each mouthful thoroughly, and it tasted rich and simple and deeply satisfying. The dried apricots were sweet and chewy, their flavor concentrated by the sun, and you ate them one by one, savoring the way they softened in your mouth. The flatbread was dry and slightly stale, but it was still good, and you tore it into pieces and ate it slowly, washing it down with sips of water from your skin. While you ate, you looked out across the plateau, and you saw nothing but the gravel and the shrubs and the moving shadows of the clouds. The wind hummed in your ears, a steady, droning note that seemed to vibrate in the bones of your skull. A single thistle, taller than the others, stood about 20 paces away, its spiny leaves trembling in the breeze, and you watched it for a while, noting the way it bent and swayed without breaking. The thistle had found a way to survive here, in this harsh, windswept place, and its survival seemed to you a quiet, unremarked miracle. When you had finished eating, you sat for a while longer, not moving, not thinking, simply being. The sun was warm on your face, and the wind was cool on your back, and the combination was pleasant, a balance of temperatures that required no adjustment. You felt your body resting, your muscles loosening, the small aches and tirednesses of the long walk slowly dissolving. You were in no hurry to move. The road would still be there when you were ready, and the plateau would still be there, and the wind would still be blowing steady and patient, waiting for you to continue. Eventually, you stood up, brushing the gravel dust from your coat and trousers. You gathered your water skin and your walking stick, settled the satchel across your chest, and looked down at the faint line of the road. It stretched away to the east, straight and true, disappearing into the haze of distance. You began to walk again, and within a few steps you had found your rhythm once more, the steady, unhurried pace that had become as natural to you as breathing. The afternoon wore on, and the plateau continued. The sun moved slowly across the sky, and the shadows of the clouds continued their silent migration, and the wind continued its low, constant song. You walked through it all with the patience of long practice, your body moving automatically, your mind drifting in its quiet, floating state. You were not aware of time passing, not in any measurable way. There was only the road, and the gravel and the wind, and the slow, steady progress of your own footsteps across the vast, open emptiness. At one point, you saw a small pile of stones beside the road, a cairn that some previous traveler had built as a marker. The stones were flat and carefully stacked, and they had been there for a long time, their surfaces weathered and worn. You stopped to look at the cairn, and you added a stone of your own, selecting a smooth, flat piece of gravel and placing it on top of the pile. The gesture was a small one, a tiny contribution to the long history of travelers who had crossed this plateau, and it felt right. You stood for a moment, your hand resting on the top of the cairn, and then you moved on. The road ahead was visible for miles, a faint line drawn across the gravel, and you followed it with your eyes as far as you could see. It did not curve or bend or dip. It simply went on, straight and true, until it disappeared into the haze of distance. The plateau was so flat and so open that you could see the road for what felt like an eternity, a thin, pale thread that connected the place where you stood to the place where you were going. The sight of it was oddly comforting, a visible reminder that the road was real, that it had a beginning and an end, that it would carry you where you needed to go. The wind, which had been humming at a steady pitch all day, began to shift slightly as the afternoon deepened. It grew a little cooler, a little fresher, and it carried with it a new scent, a faint, distant hint of something green and living. You could not identify the scent, but you welcomed it, and you breathed it in deeply, feeling it refresh your lungs and clear your mind. The plateau was still vast and empty, but there was a sense now that you were approaching its far edge, that the long, level walking would soon give way to a descent, that the next stage of the journey was waiting somewhere ahead. The sameness of the terrain had lulled you into a state close to meditation, a place where thought was merely the observation of one foot following the other, one breath following the last. You noticed the texture of the gravel beneath your boots, the way the loose stones shifted and settled with each step. You noticed the way the wind made small, swirling eddies of dust that danced across the road and then vanished. You noticed the way the sky was beginning to take on the first faint hints of evening, a subtle deepening of the blue, a slight softening of the light. All these things pass through your awareness like the shadows of the clouds, present for a moment and then gone, leaving no trace behind. And so the afternoon passed, and the plateau carried you onward, and the road continued its patient, unwavering course across the emptiness. You walked, and the wind walked with you, and the shadows of the clouds walked with you, and the sun made its slow arc across the sky. Nothing happened, and everything happened, and the journey unfolded in its own quiet, unhurried way, a single, continuous thread of movement through a world that asked nothing and offered everything. The road began its descent from the plateau so subtly that at first you did not trust the feeling. Your body had grown accustomed to the level ground, to the steady, unvaried pressure of the wind and the crunch of gravel underfoot, and the change came as a slight shift in the angle of your ankles, a faint easing of the effort required to push forward. You noticed it first in your stride, which lengthened just a little, and then in your breathing, which became a fraction shallower. The plateau, which had held you in its vast, windswept embrace for so many hours, was finally releasing you, tilting you gently toward the lower world that lay ahead. The road began to curve, the straight, unwavering line bending into a series of long, shallow switchbacks that cut across the face of the slope. The gravel underfoot gave way to a rougher surface of exposed bedrock and loose stones, and the cushioned shrubs that had dotted the plateau grew sparser, replaced by the first tentative appearance of tougher, more resilient plants. The wind, which had been a constant, pressing presence, began to drop as you descended, its voice fading from a deep hum to a softer sigh, and the air grew warmer, denser, carrying with it the faintest hint of something green and living. The descent was gradual, a long, slow slope that allowed you to walk almost as easily as you had on the flat. You did not need to lean back or brace yourself. The gradient was gentle, a natural ramp that had been shaped by centuries of use into a comfortable, manageable path. Your knees absorbed the slight extra impact with each step, and your thigh muscles worked in a different way now, controlling your descent rather than pushing you upward. It was a pleasant change, a new rhythm for the final stage of the journey, and you settled into it with the same quiet patience that had carried you through all the days before. The landscape changed as you descended, the bare, open plateau giving way to a more varied terrain. The first trees appeared, stunted and wind-bent at first, then taller and straighter as you dropped lower. They were pines mostly, their trunks dark and resinous, their needles a deep, dusty green. They grew in scattered clusters at first, then in denser stands, their branches intertwining overhead to form a broken canopy that dappled the road with shade. The smell of pine resin filled the air, sharp and clean, and you breathed it in with quiet appreciation. After the dry, scentless wind of the plateau, it was like a cool drink of water. The road continued its slow, winding descent, and you followed it with the steady, unhurried pace that had become your natural rhythm. The switchbacks were longer now, the curves more gradual, and between the trees you caught glimpses of the valley below. It was a broad green basin, larger than the one you had left behind, and it was dotted with fields and orchards and the clustered roofs of a sizable town. The town was the district seat, your final destination, and the sight of it, still far below, brought a quiet sense of approaching completion. You did not feel excitement or relief, only a calm acknowledgement that the journey was nearing its end. The road entered a narrow gorge, a cleft in the mountainside where the rock walls rose up on either side, their surfaces a deep, reddish-brown, streaked with dark lines of mineral deposits. The gorge was cool and dim, the sunlight blocked by the high walls, and the road ran along the bottom beside a small stream that tumbled over a bed of smooth stones. The sound of the stream was loud in the confined space, a constant rushing music that echoed off the rock and filled the gorge with its voice. You walked alongside the water for a while, your footsteps blending with its roar, and you felt the cool, damp air on your face like a gentle hand. The gorge opened out as suddenly as it had begun, and you found yourself on a broad, sunny slope, with the valley spread out before you in all its detail. The town was much closer now, its buildings clearly visible, whitewashed houses with terracotta roofs, a few larger structures of grey stone, and the slender minarets of several mosques rising above the rooftops. A river wound through the valley floor, a silver ribbon that caught the afternoon light, and the fields on either side were a patchwork of greens and golds and browns. The view was beautiful, in a quiet, ordinary way, and you paused for a moment to take it in, your hands resting on the top of your walking stick, your breath slow and even. The road descended more steeply now, the final drop into the valley, and you walked carefully, placing your feet with the automatic precision of long practice. The surface was paved here with large flat stones, worn smooth by centuries of hooves and cartwheels, and the edges of the road were lined with low stone walls that separated it from the orchards beyond. Olive trees grew in orderly rows on the slopes, their silver-green leaves shimmering in the gentle breeze, and you could see people working among them, small figures moving slowly in the dappled shade. The sounds of the town began to reach you, the distant crow of a rooster, the faint ring of a hammer on metal, the low murmur of many voices blended together into a soft, indistinct hum. You entered the town through an unguarded gate, a simple stone arch that spanned the road without any door or barrier. The arch was old, its stones darkened with age, and a carved inscription above the keystone was too weathered to read. You passed beneath it and into a narrow street lined with shops and houses. The street was paved with cobbles, and your boots made a sharp, echoing sound on the stones, a sound that was immediately swallowed by the general noise of the town. People moved past you on the street, a woman carrying a basket of bread on her head, a man leading a donkey laden with firewood, a group of children running and laughing. No one paid you any attention. You were just another traveler, one of many who passed through the town every day, and your presence was unremarkable. The streets wound through the town in a complex, organic pattern, following the contours of the land, and you navigated them with the quiet confidence of someone who had been here before. You passed a small square with a fountain in its center, the water splashing into a circular stone basin, and you paused to drink from your water skin and to rest for a moment on a low wall. The square was shaded by a large mulberry tree, its branches heavy with leaves, and a few old men sat on benches beneath it, talking in low voices. You listened to their conversation without really hearing the words, letting the sound wash over you like the murmur of the stream in the gorge. After a short rest, you stood up and continued on your way, following the main street as it led you deeper into the town. The buildings grew taller and more imposing, their facades decorated with carved stone and wooden balconies. This was the administrative quarter, the heart of the district government, and the streets were quieter here, the shops replaced by offices and official residences. A few clerks in dark coats hurried past, their arms full of papers, and a uniformed guard stood outside a large, iron-studded door, his expression blank and patient. You walked past him and turned down a side street, and there, at the end of the lane, was the government building. It was a two-story stone structure, solid and unadorned, with a central courtyard that you could glimpse through an arched entrance. The building was old, its walls darkened by weather and time, and the windows on the ground floor were small and barred, giving it a fortress-like appearance. But the courtyard, when you stepped into it, was a different world, a quiet open space with a central fountain and a few orange trees growing in large clay pots. The fountain was simple, a stone basin with water bubbling up from a pipe, and the sound of it was soft and soothing, a gentle counterpoint to the noise of the town beyond the walls. The courtyard was empty except for a single clerk who sat at a wooden desk near the entrance writing in a ledger. He looked up as you entered, his pen pausing in mid-stroke, and he gave you a brief, professional nod. You approached the desk and told him your business in a low voice, the words as simple and direct as the journey itself. You were a messenger, you said, carrying a sealed scroll from the outpost in the Western Valley, and you had come to deliver it. The clerk listened without expression, then nodded again and gestured toward a door on the far side of the courtyard. You thanked him with a quiet word and walked across the courtyard, your footsteps echoing on the stone pavement. The door led to a small dim room with a high ceiling and a floor of polished stone. A long wooden counter divided the room, and behind it sat another clerk, older than the first, with grey hair and ink-stained fingers. He was reading a document through a pair of spectacles perched low on his nose, and he looked up as you entered, his eyes calm and unsurprised. You approach the counter and set your satchel upon it, unbuckling the strap with the same practiced motion you had used so many times before. You withdrew the scroll and placed it on the counter, the red wax seal facing up, and you stepped back, your hands resting at your sides. The clerk set down his document, picked up the scroll, and examined the seal with a brief professional glance. He turned it over in his hands, checking for any damage, any sign that the seal had been tampered with. And then he produced a small knife from his desk and slid the blade under the wax. The seal broke with a soft, dry crack, the wax splitting cleanly into two pieces, and you watched it happen with a strange, quiet feeling that you did not examine. The clerk unrolled the scroll, his eyes moving across the lines of text, and he read the message with the same expressionless efficiency with which he had broken the seal. The message, whatever it was, required no immediate action, no exclamation, no summons. It was simply another piece of paper in the vast, slow-moving machinery of the Empire. When he had finished reading, the clerk set the scroll aside and reached for a different ledger, a thick book bound in dark leather. He opened it to a fresh page and made a brief entry, the nib of his pen scratching softly on the paper. The entry, you knew, would record the date, the origin of the scroll, your name or a description of you, and the time of delivery. It was the same kind of entry that had been made at every station along your route, a small, quiet act of bureaucratic completion. When he had finished, he took a small slip of paper and stamped it with a wooden seal, then handed it to you across the counter. The paper was your receipt, your proof of delivery, and you took it with a